The date is March 4, 2022, and after years of deliberation, both Georgia and Bosnia and Herzegovina have officially been accepted as full NATO partners. Ukraine now reinvigorates its push for NATO membership, while Russia has for the last 6 months warned of military action. Alarmed by what it views as encroachment of NATO on its borders, Russia at last responds to the ascension of Bosnia and Herzegovina and Georgia by massing forces on its western border. Russia is gambling that the other NATO nations will reconsider admitting the 2 new members, or at least not be willing to go to war over the defense of brand new members to the alliance. Russia, however, has completely underestimated the solidarity of the alliance, realizing that NATO is in essence a worthless entity unless Article 5 of the treaty is immediately enforced. NATO warns Russia that an attack on one ally is considered an attack on all allies. To reinforce the point, NATO troops are sent into Estonia, Latvia, and Lithuania, the alliance's most vulnerable members given their direct proximity to Russia. Russia, however, sees this as an unacceptable show of force, and the move proves to be the straw that breaks the camel's back. Without warning, Russian armor pours into Latvia and Lithuania, linking up with forces in Kaliningrad. World War III has officially begun. For the first month of fighting, Russian forces push as far west as Poland, but the offensive grinds to a halt as NATO members finish mobilizing and their resistance solidifies. With American troops and equipment making landfall in France and Germany, NATO is now launching vicious counterattacks against Russia's forces in Poland. In the Pacific, the American Navy steams towards Russia's eastern coast, bringing with it a Marine Expeditionary Force meant to open a second front in the war and split Russia's forces. Russia is faced with a losing proposition and decides to gamble. It authorizes a single nuclear strike against Berlin, betting that while European NATO members may retaliate with their limited nuclear arsenals, the Americans won't risk the destruction of their cities to support their European allies. The date is now April 12th, 0205 hours Zulu. American and Chinese infrared recon satellites both pick up the telltale fiery plume of an ICBM launch from a missile farm in the south of Russia. 2 minutes later, the American president is awoken from his sleep and given the news. Russia has launched a single nuclear device, unknown payload, likely target in Western Europe. The U.S. Air Force's Global Strike Command has for weeks been flying nuclear alert missions with its fleet of B-52 bombers, maintaining a nuclear-armed force in the air 24 hours a day, 7 days a week, as its predecessor, the Strategic Air Command, once did for decades during the Cold War. With the detected launch of a Russian nuclear weapon, a priority flash is immediately dispatched to the airborne forces and alert forces on the ground. Flight crews stationed overseas in Japan, on the west coast of the United States, and in Europe all review their single integrated operational plan, which lays out the exact flight route, refueling track, and targets for each of the bomber crews. Most aircraft have 2 primary targets, with 2 alternate targets to be struck should they be unable to make it to their primary targets. Within minutes, the crews are in the air, and those already on alert patrols immediately set their course for the positive control turnaround point, a pre-planned point near Russia where the air crews will automatically turn around unless they receive an order to strike. At missile sites across the American Midwest, the giant concrete shutters that protect the buried missiles inside their launch facilities are automatically rolled back, and the security forces personnel tasked with defending those sites go on full alert. Their orders are to defend the silos until every missile has been launched, after which they are to escort surviving missile crews out and back to a rendezvous point well away from the missile farm. For these sites will be a priority target for incoming Russian missiles. Inside underground bunkers, missile operators rehearse launch procedures, each man responsible for a group of missiles. The entire system only requires 2 out of 4 of the operators to authenticate a launch order, just in case 2 of the men get cold feet about launching a nuclear Armageddon and refuse their orders. Deep in the Arctic, Pacific, and Atlantic Ocean, the U.S.'s extremely low-frequency communication system flashes a nuclear alert to America's ballistic missile submarine fleet. Each sub carries 24 Trident missiles, and each missile carries up to 8 independently targetable warheads with a yield of 475 kilotons. America's fleet of hunter-killer attack submarines have for weeks been stalking and eliminating Russia's aging ballistic missile submarines, and the survivors are bottled up near the Russian shore where they can be protected with shore-based firepower and anti-submarine patrols. Now, America's attack submarines set course for Russia's coast, and their mission is to eliminate Russia's surviving nuke boats, though it will cost America's submarine fleet dearly, as Russia's Air Force and Surface Navy fiercely defend their surviving ballistic missile subs. At 0209 hours, the American president is told that the American recon assets have positive confirmation of a nuclear detonation in Berlin. The Russians have fired an older single-warhead ICBM, yet with a yield large enough to completely destroy the city of 3.6 million. On a hotline direct with the Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, the president is told that Britain is already issuing a fire order to retaliate for the attack. The president knows that the attack on Berlin was a gamble by the Russians, who don't believe that the US will risk an escalation and attacks on its own cities to defend Europe. An emergency flash is dispatched by the US's ELF communication system to a lurking Ohio-class submarine currently on station deep beneath the ice of the North Pole. After authenticating the order, the sub breaches through the 5-foot-thick ice and the door on a single dorsally mounted launch tube props open. The navigation system on the Trident II missile located inside the launch tube is activated, and a mission trajectory is automatically loaded into the flight computer. Then, a steam generator ignites a solid-grain rocket motor, which feeds superheated exhaust into a tank of chilled water. The water evaporates and expands, forcing the missile within the launch tube to be launched upwards and out. After which, the first stage motor ignites and the missile screams upward and towards space. An astro-inertial guidance system on board the missile uses star positioning to fine-tune the accuracy of its trajectory, as GPS has long been unreliable due to Russian attacks on NATO satellites. The Russians have bet wrong, and minutes later, 8 475-kiloton warheads detonate over the Russian missile facility which launched the Berlin attack. Simultaneously, a British attack strikes the cities of Ekaterinburg and Novosibirsk, with a population of 1.5 million or 3 million together. NATO has responded in kind to the Berlin attack, and America has both punished Russia's nuclear forces for the attack and shown that it will stand with its allies. In the halls of the Kremlin, a desperate power struggle plays out. 3 million Russians lie dead, and the US has obliterated one of Russia's major nuclear missile facilities, destroying dozens of ICBMs in place. Russian ballistic submarines, considered to be the most survivable element of the nuclear triad, have also been decimated by American attack submarines, though the US has lost 12 subs of its own in its quest to eliminate the remaining Russian boats. Military leadership clashes with the civilian leadership and demands a retaliatory attack on American missile facilities. With US reinforcements in force on the Western Front and Russians starting to lose ground in Poland, battlefield commanders have for the last week been requesting a release on strategic nuclear weapons to use against American infantry and tanks. The fierce debate on the use of tactical weapons is reignited, and when further nuclear attacks are denied, Russian military leadership stages a stunning coup. The Russian president is removed from power, and Russian commanders receive authorization for the use of a dozen tactical weapons against NATO forces in Europe. Within a half hour, NATO troop concentrations in Poland are hammered by low-yield nuclear attacks, killing tens of thousands. American reinforcements fresh from the States and currently massing around the Ramstein military facilities in Germany are hit with 3 tactical devices. The Marine Expeditionary Force in the Pacific, staging out of Japan, is also struck by a single device, as are the 2 naval carrier battle groups supporting the invasion. By 9 a.m., American military forces have suffered more casualties than all wars since World War II combined, and the ability for NATO to push back Russian forces in Poland is eliminated. While Russia has maintained an inventory of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons to counter America's overwhelming conventional firepower advantage, the United States has not kept an active inventory of tactical devices for decades. This leaves the American president with few options for a comparable retaliatory attack. While the yields on America's airborne submarine and ground-launched nuclear devices can be dialed down, there's no way to broadcast that fact to the Russians, and little chance they'd believe it. An attack with traditional ICBMs, submarine-launched missiles, or airborne nuclear cruise missiles will seem to Russia like a full-blown attack and risk escalating the war into a total nuclear confrontation. Yet the president has little choice. Tens of thousands of American service members are dead. U.S. forces in Europe have been badly damaged by the attacks, and both carrier battle groups supporting the Pacific invasion are reporting major losses of ships, aircraft, and personnel. The Marine Invasion Force in Okinawa is combat ineffective, 4 divisions reporting over 55% casualties each. Resigning himself to a list of terrible options, the president orders a retaliatory attack using ground-based ICBMs. The Air Force's Global Strike Command nuclear bomber fleet is to approach and hold at their failsafe points, ready to proceed to their targets should Russia retaliate again. At Minot Air Force Base in North Dakota, a launch order is authorized by the 2-man Minuteman launch crew, and a single Minuteman III missile roars into the night sky. 60 seconds later, the second stage of the missile ignites, separating from the spent first booster stage. Adjustments using the second stage thrust vector control keeps the missile on its course, and another 60 seconds later, the flight computer separates the second stage and fires the engine on the third and final stage. By now, the missile has reached space, and as the third stage engine burns out, reversed thrust thrust separates the 3 warheads and their penetration aids from the launch vehicle. Some of the penetration aids explode, showering space with millions of pieces of reflective aluminum, which wreak havoc on radar used by missile interceptors, while other aids simulate the real warheads and serve as dummy targets for any Russian interceptors. With no real Russian anti-ballistic missile defense programs though, the warheads and the dummies all re-enter the Earth's atmosphere completely unharmed. 23 minutes after launch, 3 separate 475-kiloton nuclear explosions rock Eastern Europe. Russian forces in Poland are obliterated by 2 nuclear strikes many times greater in magnitude than those used against NATO forces, while yet another Russian nuclear missile facility is struck by the 3rd warhead. With American weapons targeting their missile fields and systematically eliminating Russia's ability to respond to nuclear attacks, the final order is given for a full-blown nuclear response. American reconnaissance satellites and electronic eavesdropping assets all pick up the telltale signs of preparatory operations for a nuclear launch across Russia's remaining missile farms. The order to attack is mirrored in the US, and launch officers in North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana receive the order to launch. Simultaneously, American airborne assets receive an emergency flash, which when authenticated authorizes the air crews to proceed to their targets with full nuclear release. American ballistic missile submarines breach through the thick polar ice or rise to 25 feet below the waves of the Pacific in the North Sea. As Russian missiles clear their silos, it's America's nuclear ballistic missile subs which launch the first wave of retaliatory attacks, almost as fast as Russian ground forces. American submarine-launched missiles target Russia's remaining missile fields in a desperate hope to destroy them before they can finish launch operations. But for the most part, the American strikes fail to stop the launches. Secondary military targets are then struck, with major Russian military bases, supply depots, troop staging areas, and airfields all being obliterated in nuclear fire within 10 minutes of the start of the Russian attack. As Russia's ICBMs climb into the atmosphere, a wave of American ballistic missile defense systems immediately spring into action. Having spent billions on ballistic missile defense since the 1980s, all in a bid to make Reagan's Star Wars concept a reality, America now attacks the incoming missiles with a variety of tools. Airborne laser systems in Europe and flying in the Pacific managed to strike at a handful of ICBMs during their vulnerable ascent stage, superheating the missile body from hundreds of miles away with a powerful aircraft-mounted laser system. As the missiles climb into space, ballistic missile defense sites across the west coast of the United States launch their ground-based interceptors. Using a powerful radar, the interceptors scream toward the incoming missiles in a bid to destroy them through kinetic impact before they can re-enter the atmosphere. The Russian missiles, however, immediately disperse their own penetration aids, and a shower of billions of pieces of aluminum chaff wreaks hell on American interceptor radar. The interceptors switch to their visual interception systems, and advanced computer programs frantically scramble to identify the incoming warheads visually, ignoring the clouds of chaff. Half of the interceptors miss their targets, the other half manage to strike, yet of the successful intercepts, a full third are of dummy warheads. To make matters worse, the US only has an inventory of about 60 interceptors ready to fire and are completely overwhelmed by an incoming horde of hundreds of independently targeted warheads. 24 minutes after launch, the West Coast is the first hit. 1 megaton strikes against Los Angeles, Seattle, Portland, and others obliterate the most populated cities on the American West Coast. A follow-on 450 kiloton strike destroys the Los Angeles harbor area, along with tens of thousands of homes and the naval base at San Diego. Edwards Air Force Base in the California desert is struck by 2 450 kiloton strikes, as is Vandenberg Air Force Base. 3 minutes later, nuclear impacts strike the American Midwest. North American Aerospace Defense Command at Peterson Air Force Base is incinerated by a megaton blast, and the Cheyenne Mountain Complex is struck by 2 ground penetration munitions, though the blasts managed to do little damage to the deeply buried facility. Strikes continue to roll eastwards, and a saturation of 300 kiloton strikes decimates the American Farm Belt. These munitions are programmed to be ground bursts, resulting in the scattering of millions of tons of highly radioactive dirt across America's most fertile farmland. Another 3 minutes later, and the East Coast is struck by the Russian ICBMs. Washington is obliterated by 2 separate megaton blasts, as is New York City, the financial heart of America. The American president, however, is safe from the nuclear blasts. He has long ago boarded what is nicknamed the Doomsday Plane, an airborne command post from which he can still manage America's remaining military and civilian forces. With satellite and ground communications completely eradicated, a fleet of Air Force planes now makes up a global command and control system, linking up surviving military forces with the president. Soon, his plane will land at an intact airfield and he'll be helicoptered out to a surviving supercarrier, from which he will continue to command the survivors of America's military and oversee the reconstruction, if any possible, of what remains of America, all from the safety of the Atlantic Ocean. 24 hours before launch, Russia has threatened NATO to cease providing Ukraine with weapons and ammunition for weeks, and at last it's made good on its promise to take military action against any NATO convoys bringing such aid into the country. Just inside the Ukrainian border, a convoy of NATO vehicles is strafed by 2 Russian Su-25s. The unarmed transports are decimated by gunfire and rockets deployed by the Russian jets. There are no survivors. 23 hours before launch, verification of the deserted convoy has finally reached the desk of the President of the United States. The convoy was being manned by Polish soldiers who'd helped their Ukrainian counterparts unload American C-130s and pack up the much-needed war supplies inside of Polish territory. The shipment of modern weapons was safe as long as it remained outside of Ukraine, but immediately upon crossing the border, Russia declared it a legal military target. Now the President of the US has a very difficult decision to make, and he immediately sets up a secure call with the heads of several NATO nations. 19 hours, 24 minutes before launch. Earlier in the war, NATO warned Russia that an attack on any of its convoys would constitute an Article 5 response. After a lengthy and heated discussion, the United States, Great Britain, France, Spain, Norway, Germany, and Poland all invoke Article 5 of the alliance. An attack on one is an attack on all. Other NATO members are being brought up to date as their leadership is being informed of the attack. Because the attack was not directly inside NATO territory, some members of the alliance, like Turkey, are having serious reservations. 2 hours before launch, the United States, Great Britain, France, Poland, and Germany have all been prepared for the possibility of an attack by Russia, either into Poland or on Polish transports and logistics personnel assisting the Ukrainians. The 5 states decide to send Russia a strong message, and combat planes kept on alert for such an eventuality have been taking to the skies already for the last half hour. A massive lightning strike force of NATO planes is approaching various Russian military targets in Kaliningrad, Ukraine, and even along Russian borders itself. 1 hour, 18 minutes before launch. NATO planes overwhelm Russian defenses, who are completely unprepared for NATO's massive response. The attack purposely avoids striking Russian troop concentrations and instead lays waste to supply and fuel depots, runways, logistics hubs, and air defense sites. The Russian military giant has proved itself to be clumsy and inept in modern combat. And while a few NATO jets are lost to Russian air defenses, the attack is an overwhelming success. It's hoped that the attack will be enough to deter Russia from further aggression, and the targets were specifically picked in order to avoid large casualties for just this reason. NATO is still hoping to avoid all-out war with Russia, but the attack against a Polish convoy carrying NATO weapons simply cannot be ignored. 19 minutes before launch. Reports of NATO airstrikes have been rolling into Russia's general staff for the last hour and 8 minutes. The attack was a complete and total humiliation for Russia, as its much-vaunted air defense network was easily suppressed by a massive quantity of highly capable NATO planes. The resulting chaos has produced few military casualties, but opened up serious vulnerability gaps along the Russian border, inviting further incursion of NATO air power. Perhaps worst of all, it's shown that the nation cannot simply match the overpowering technological and doctrinal superiority of NATO's professional militaries. But the president of the Russian Federation, Vladimir Putin, has been prepared for this. He has only one last card left to play, the only thing keeping NATO from absolutely steamrolling his forces in Ukraine and relegating Russia to a third-rate world power for the next century: nuclear weapons. Putin will send a message of his own. If he fails to, NATO will understand that it has near-complete impunity to attack Russia from the air by exploiting the gaps it created in its first assault along the Russian air defense network. An aide rushes over to President Putin carrying the Cheget, Russia's equivalent to the nuclear football. Much like the American version, the Cheget carries inside of it sealed authorization codes that relay President Putin's orders to his general staff. Putin selects his desired option and transmits the code to the general staff. The signal is uplinked directly to the Kavkaz secret communications network that links the senior-most Russian leadership together. Verified as authentic by the general staff, which had already been gathered beforehand, the signal is then relayed directly to local weapons commanders. This is one of 2 ways for Russia to launch its nuclear arsenal, the second being its dead hand or perimeter system. This command system allows Russia to launch its nukes even if its entire senior leadership is eliminated in one sudden decapitation strike. Dead Hand was developed in response to U.S. advances in submarine-launched nuclear weapons, which in the 1980s became capable of the precision required for a decapitation strike with only a 3-minute warning thanks to the Trident D5. Using a network of seismic, light, radioactivity, and pressure sensors, Dead Hand can trigger a full-scale retaliatory response even if the entire senior Russian leadership is annihilated in one strike. To get the alert out, a specially modified ICBM is launched which carries a powerful transmitter instead of a nuke and relays a mass launch order across the entire Russian nuclear triad. 13 minutes before launch, a single launch order has been relayed to an RS-12M1 Topol-M ICBM unit. The road mobile launcher is harder to destroy in a first strike than ICBMs based on static missile fields, and this particular missile is based far in Russia's east, inside the Kamchatka Peninsula. The missile is already resting in an erected launch configuration, so it only takes a crew a few minutes to authenticate the order and make last-minute preparations for launch. When everything's ready to go, the launch order is given by the senior launch officer as the crew seeks shelter behind a rocky outcropping in case the aging missile experiences a launch failure. Russia's nuclear arsenal is getting into ever-worsening disrepair as the years go by, and the Russian Federation tries to live up to the old glory of the Soviet Union. Launch. The cone at the top of the Topol-M container is blown off by a series of small explosive charges. Then the massive missile roars to life. The solid-fuel rocket shudders as its engine comes online and lifts the 104,000-pound missile into the sky. Even as it's lifting off, the missile's guidance computer begins to connect to Russia's GLONASS satellite network. It's guided by both the inertial guidance and GLONASS satellite uplink, giving it some of the greatest precision of any missiles in the Russian arsenal. Uplink to GLONASS is critical, as the Topol-M isn't targeting a major city, which it could achieve with fair but not precision accuracy with only its inertial guidance systems. Instead, the Russian nuclear missile is targeting an American carrier strike group currently in transit south of Japan. Russia aims to teach the U.S. a lesson with the only weapon it can effectively bring to bear against its military superpower. 15 seconds after launch. Just 15 seconds after launch, a satellite belonging to the United States space-based infrared system detects the massive thermal signature of a large rocket lifting off into the sky. U.S. early warning satellites have been extremely good at detecting missile launches and have even been used to track the launch of much smaller cruise missiles in Russia's conflicts in Ukraine and Syria. The massive Topol-M rocket lights up the early warning satellite's thermal sensor like a blowtorch in the middle of a blizzard. The satellite immediately links up with multiple American Milstar satellites and sends a flash alert to the 2nd Space Warning Squadron at Buckley Air Force Base in Colorado, as well as other units across the entire web of the U.S. missile defense. 25 seconds after launch. Punching through cloud cover, the eyes of multiple American early warning satellites are picking up the telltale thermal plume of a massive intercontinental ballistic missile. Internally, the satellites compare the thermal plume and other telemetry, such as speed, to positively identify the Russian missile as a Topol-M. 30 seconds after launch. The Russian missile is now entering the upper atmosphere in a highly inclined trajectory. To watching satellites, this is indicative of a strike somewhere far closer to Russian shores than the American homeland. The missile is also moving in the wrong direction for a strike in the U.S., as in that case it should be moving north to fly over the Arctic Circle. 1 minute 15 seconds after launch. The President of the United States has been made aware of the missile launch. America's space-based surveillance network confirms no additional launches. New telemetry also confirms that this missile is not being fired toward the American homeland. There is hope that this is simply a show of strength, an unannounced missile test with a dummy payload. However, the trajectory of the missile leaves Japan and the U.S. base in Guam under threat. 1 minute 45 seconds after launch. An emergency alert is broadcast via Milstar satellites to every combat command and deployed carrier strike group around the world. Ballistic missile defenses are activated in Japan and Guam, as the Japanese Prime Minister is being alerted to the threat. However, the missile's trajectory makes it very unlikely that a strike is incoming toward the Japanese islands. Guam is a suspected target, but so is a transient carrier strike group, even now crossing south of Japan toward the South China Sea for routine freedom of navigation exercises. If the strike is against the U.S. carrier, there are only minutes for it to prepare to defend itself against a nuclear attack. 2 minutes 33 seconds after launch. The gravity of the threat has been relayed to the transiting American carrier and her escorts. Orders are immediately given for the ships in the formation to begin to spread out and put even more distance than normal between themselves. This is so that a strike against the group may damage most of the ships, but actually only sink a few. 3 minutes after launch. Jets are ordered to be cleared from the deck of the carrier and rushed below. It's a lengthy process to move a combat aircraft from the deck of a carrier to below decks, via the massive aircraft elevators, and unlikely that more than 1 or 2 planes could be successfully transferred from a busy deck to below. But all attempts to minimize loss of personnel and all valuable aircraft must be made. Any non-essential crew to the current threat is ordered to brace. Damage control teams are ordered to begin to assemble. Even a glancing blow will likely still cause significant damage to the ship. 3 minutes, 22 seconds after launch. The carrier's Aegis-equipped missile cruiser begins preparations for a ballistic missile defense. Its powerful Spy-1 radar begins sweeping the skies above for the incoming threat, though for now the missile is still far outside of its detection capabilities. 6 minutes, 41 seconds after launch. Nearly 7 minutes after launch, the Topol-M missile separates the warhead delivery vehicle from the tree-stage rocket. This now splits open in a cloud of chaff meant to confuse American radar, and 4 warheads are jettisoned. Only one of the warheads is real. The other 3 are cleverly designed decoys meant to lure in interceptors and allow the real warhead to hit its target. The Russian missile has been experiencing some difficulties to date, however. American electronic attacks against the GLONASS system as well as space-based radar satellites have forced the missile to rely largely on inertial guidance as it makes its way to the last known location of the carrier strike group. Given that the carrier now has increased to its classified top speed, estimated to be well over 30 knots, this missile's accuracy is decreasing by the minute. 6 minutes, 43 seconds after launch. American space-based satellites blast the cloud of chaff hiding the 3 decoys and 1 real warhead with high-powered radar, as powerful computers crunch through the data to work to reduce the effect of electronic noise created by the highly reflective chaff. In a few seconds, they have the telltale signature of at least 4 warheads. Using classified sensor technologies, the American satellites attempt to discern the real warhead from the fakes by measuring very subtle variations in the 4 warheads. Luckily, the Aegis missile defense cruiser waiting below has numerous interceptors ready to defend the strike group. But time will be of the essence, and the task of intercepting a ballistic missile is still incredibly difficult. In testing under realistic conditions, U.S. missile defenses have had a spotty record to date. Another spot on that record today will mean the death of thousands and the loss of over $15 billion in military hardware. 8 minutes, 33 seconds after launch. The warheads have only a short flight time in space due to the proximity of the launcher versus its target, which is adding to the difficulty in interception. Data is of the greatest importance in successful missile interception, and gathering data takes time which is officially about to run out. The warheads begin their terminal descent down into the atmosphere. The Aegis cruiser's powerful Spy-1 radar lights them up from below. On the ship's deck, multiple SM-6 missiles fire off into the pre-dawn sky. A few seconds later, a second volley of missiles lights up, followed a few seconds later by yet a third. The cruiser is taking 0 chances and maximizing its odds of successful interception with multiple volleys. If they fail, thousands of sailors will die. 9 minutes, 55 seconds after launch. The ship's AN/SPG-62 X-band radar illuminates the incoming warheads and helps provide terminal guidance to the SM-6 interceptors. The ability to directly network with both seaborne and space-based sensors allowed the Aegis cruiser to cut through most of the electronic noise caused by the massive cloud of chaff released as a countermeasure. There are still doubts about which warhead is the real target, and thus each warhead is assigned multiple interceptors. This increases the chances of targeting the right warhead, but reduces the chances of successfully intercepting it. The crew holds its breath as the incoming tracks quickly merge with the ship's defenses. 10 minutes, 5 seconds after launch. Closing in at a speed of 1,700 meters a second, the first wave of interceptors managed to knock out one of the decoys with a near hit by the SM-6's explosive fragmentation warhead. The warhead suffers severe structural damage from the shrapnel and explosion and tumbles out of control at thousands of miles an hour, destroying itself in the lower atmosphere. 10 minutes, 9 seconds after launch. The second volley of SM-6 missiles failed to hit a single target. 10 minutes, 13 seconds after launch. The third volley of interceptors knock out a second dummy warhead. 10 minutes, 15 seconds after launch. 60 miles below the 2 incoming warheads, there's no way for the strike group's crews to know if they've knocked out a real warhead or only dummies. Orders have already been given for all to brace for impact, and damage control crews are on standby to immediately pounce on any fires or see to fixing hull breaches and flooding. 10 minutes, 20 seconds after launch. A massive fireball explodes 3,000 meters above the sea somewhere south of Japan. The massive explosion sends out a wave of electromagnetic and thermal radiation that temporarily overpower satellite sensors. Gradually, the noise fades and these electronic eyes in the sky begin to frantically scan for signs of the strike group. The strike has been off by just over a mile, meaning that the carrier strike group has avoided the most lethal part of the nuclear attack. However, a massive pressure wave slams into the strike group, and causes moderate structural damage. On the big carrier, most of the planes left on the deck, even those secured by tie-downs, are blown off and into the ocean by the hurricane gale winds smashing into the strike group. With crews ordered below decks, the initial release of radiation is largely harmless to the strike group's personnel. This is helped by the fact that the strike group was just outside the most lethal radius of the nuclear explosion. Despite this, numerous crew are killed across the strike group from the effect of the pressure wave. Several of the ships are flooding, but damage control crews are already on their way to enact repairs. Compartments too damaged for effective flood control are simply sealed off to keep the rest of the ship from also flooding. This dooms several sailors to a drowning death, as their comrades make the impossible choice of trapping them inside flooding sections in order to save the ship. The Russian nuclear strike has effectively rendered an entire strike group combat ineffective, as the ships must now limp to the nearest friendly port for immediate repairs. Decontamination must also be undertaken even before the ships arrive at port, and damage to the flight deck of the carrier repaired to make air operations impossible. However, things could have been far worse if Russia had used more than one missile, as they would in a serious attempt at sinking an American carrier and her accompanying escorts. The fact that Russian nuclear command and control systems, as well as their space surveillance and guidance, and even the missiles themselves, are in great disrepair, helped limit possible damage as well. Russian guidance networks such as GLONASS are very vulnerable to disruption, making Russian weapons far from precise. Despite only suffering moderate damage, however, Russia has just launched a nuclear weapon against the armed forces of the United States of America. A full NATO Article 5 response is now inevitable, as is a state of war against a greatly outmatched Russian Federation. Faced with the certainty of losing a war against superior NATO forces, President Vladimir Putin must now contemplate expanding the use of nuclear weapons to defend his hold on power inside the Kremlin and fend off NATO attacks. Yet in the American White House, the President of the United States is now even reviewing options for a similar attack against a Russian military facility. The world stands on the brink of full-scale nuclear war in what might be the greatest and final conflict of the human race. Boom! Blinding light washes out the landscape around you. Several things all happen within a second. First, your vehicle dies as an electromagnetic pulse spreads at the speed of light, killing all unshielded electronics. In the civilian world, that means practically everything. If you were not blinded by the flash of the explosion, you'd see sparks dancing along the high-voltage wires overhead, as they're overloaded with electricity. All modern vehicles that rely on fancy computers and electronic gadgets that make them super efficient and comfortable are now just useless hunks of junk on four wheels. Personal computers, cell phones, even pacemakers are all instantly shut down across a 40-mile radius, and they'll never come back online again. The power grid is absolutely ruined and will need to be completely replaced before it's ever operational again, a task that will take years. You're lucky that you were driving in the opposite direction of the detonation point, because if not, you would have been facing toward it. What's just happened about a mile above your city is the birth of a second sun that burns brightly for just a few milliseconds. That's all that's needed to unleash a billion joules of energy, though. And much of that energy is in the visible wavelength and searing the eyes of anyone who happened to be even glancing in its general direction at detonation. Those within a 2 to 3 mile radius will be blind forever, assuming they survive what's coming next, while anyone outside of that area might be blind for a matter of hours or minutes depending on the distance. Even those who avoided being permanently blinded will likely suffer at least some vision loss as a result. You're safely out of the immediate impact area, but for those who aren't, ionizing radiation tears through their bodies from the detonation. Their DNA is completely unraveled as the ionizing radiation rips through them. It's like taking millions of microscopic shotgun blasts, only these pellets completely disintegrate the very instructions for life. Most people within a half a mile will die immediately from the radiation exposure, if what comes in the next few seconds doesn't kill them, of course. Outside of that range, the effects of radiation poisoning fall off steeply. You were in your car, which protected you from a lot of the thermal radiation, but not all of it. Your arm was hanging out the window, and even at over 2 miles from the detonation point, your arm has suffered some pretty nasty second-degree burns. You're lucky. 35% of the energy from a nuclear explosion is released as heat, and anyone caught out in the open can suffer third-degree burns at a distance of up to 5 miles. If third-degree burns cover 24% of the person's body, or second-degree burns cover 30% of their body, those individuals will go into serious shock, with death imminent. All flammable material directly under and surrounding the blast site catches on fire because of the intense heat. Even at 2 miles out, some of the paint on your car evaporates, and the car door becomes painfully hot to the touch. Tires on vehicles all around you burst as the rubber softens and weakens, while billboards catch on fire. People caught out in the open are consumed in flames as their clothes ignite while they're still wearing them. Some people's hair is literally seared off their heads. leaving behind painful second-degree burns across their scalp. This has just been 1 second into a nuclear detonation. Your car spins out of control as the tires go flat, but you're lucky to come to an abrupt but mostly safe stop. You have barely enough time to look into the rearview mirror before you see what's coming next. Like an invisible tsunami, the pressure wave is now smashing its way across the landscape, starting from the detonation point and radiating outwards. This has been a nuclear attack using an intercontinental ballistic missile, so the explosion took place a few hundred meters above the city. This way, the pressure wave could expand outwards unimpeded by terrain and buildings. A ground impact is highly unfavorable, as it leads to buildings or terrain features absorbing much of the pressure wave and limiting the damage dramatically. Directly below and up to a mile away from the detonation point, the destruction is complete. Buildings are flattened and tall skyscrapers are annihilated, leaving behind only the very core of each building, jutting up a few hundred feet like a shattered skeletal figure. Plenty of sewers and service tunnels crisscross a modern city, not to mention transportation tunnels in the subway. All of these are collapsed, killing hundreds stuck below or trapping them with no hope of rescue. Outside of a mile, the damage falls off, but is still severe. Multiple-story buildings are seriously damaged, leading to many simply collapsing in on themselves or against their neighbors. Buildings with only a few stories are less severely affected, but have every single window blown out and many of their roofs collapse, killing anyone below. At least the tunnels and sewers that crisscross the city here are safe from collapse. Only a few are seriously damaged. Almost no human beings up to 2 miles out survive if caught out in the open. You're just over 2 miles out from detonation, and here the damage falls off once again. Windows are blown out and some roofs and walls collapse, but generally buildings remain standing. As the pressure wave catches up to you, your car is physically picked up and tossed, like an angry kid playing with their Hot Wheels cars. The pressure wave blows your car over and threatens to tip it, but you're too far away and your car comes crashing back down onto all 4 wheels. Debris pelts the landscape around you, and you're mostly safe inside your car. A few people standing out in the street get taken out by chunks of concrete hurtled through the air by a 300-mile-an-hour wind. The roar of a second sun coming to life above your city has been so incredibly loud that you've temporarily lost all hearing. It'll probably return in time, but for those closer to detonation, they could experience permanent or severe hearing loss. A strange silence falls over the city 5 seconds after detonation as a massive mushroom cloud slowly drifts up into the sky. Then the screaming starts. Tens of thousands of people seriously injured, tens of thousands less so. You're now on a ticking clock because you've survived the initial explosion through sheer luck, but surviving what comes next is going to take skills, knowledge, and quick thinking. Tick-tock, tick-tock. You've got 15 minutes before you're dead. What's currently happening and what will kill even more people than the initial explosion is that an ecological disaster is in the brew and about to break out all over you and every survivor in your city. The detonation of a nuclear weapon above your city has sent ionizing radiation all over the landscape, penetrating into the very building materials of the city itself. The thermal flash and pressure wave pulverized all of that irradiated material and turned it into a very fine dust. Then the incredible heat, reaching as much as the surface of the sun for a few milliseconds, creates huge convection currents that suck up gargantuan quantities of air and sends it roaring upward into the sky, hence the mushroom cloud. But all that air is impregnated with billions of tons of highly radioactive dust, and in approximately 15 minutes, that dust is going to start falling all around you. You panic because you know what's coming, but you've got a choice to make. You could probably find a working vehicle somewhere and take that to flee the city, trying to outrun the fallout cloud that's about to break over your head. In fact, many people along the suburbs right now are climbing into their cars to do just that. But you're smarter than that. You know that even if you found a working vehicle in the next minute, you could never outrun the cloud of fallout looming overhead. It's being propelled along by winds in the upper atmosphere and will outpace anything but the fastest sports car. Plus, the roads and highways are inevitably going to be choked up with vehicles and other people with the same idea. The particles in the stem of the mushroom cloud will end up falling right back down where they were picked up. Not many people will die from them, but that's pretty much only because anyone under the growing thick black sooty stem of a massive mushroom cloud is already dead from the initial explosion. It's the rest of the billowing cloud that you have to worry about because what goes up definitely comes down. But you're not the only one in danger, as much of the radioactive fallout will reach the uppermost layers of the atmosphere where it will be carried along by strong winds. Massive plumes of radiation will fall for hundreds of miles from the detonation point, poisoning communities entire states away. This is the very reason why Russia might saber-rattle and talk tough about using tactical nuclear weapons in Ukraine, but in reality it would only be shooting itself in the foot, as prevailing winds would carry much of the fallout right back into Russia itself. To avoid dying in the next 15 minutes, you have a choice to make. Avoiding radiation poisoning is about 3 things: time, distance, and shielding. The more time you spend away from a radiation source, the safer you'll be, as the radioactive decay, especially in fission byproducts of nuclear explosions, tends to make dangerous particles extremely short-lived. The greater the distance between you and an unshielded radioactive source also means you'll be exposed to less radiation. Meanwhile, shielding takes into account placing barriers between yourself and a radioactive source. If you can't meet the requirements of one, time, distance, or shielding, then you must compensate by adding even more of the other 2 requirements. To survive a nuclear attack, you're going to have to do all 3, though. First, take a look around you. Your first choice, and the absolute worst, is to remain in your vehicle. This will put some shielding and distance between yourself and the fallout. The only good news is that the radioactive debris about to rain down on you is only hazardous if it's extremely close to your body. So if your car can simply physically keep it away from you, odds of survival have greatly increased. You need to put all the windows up and close all the vents, stuffing them with anything that you have available. You can't let there be a single crack. The first radioactive particles to fall will be the size of grains of sand or salt, and these should be easy to keep out. However, over time, the finer radioactive debris will begin to descend, and this can be as small as specks of dust. In fact, you can detect the presence of radioactive fallout after a nuclear explosion simply by seeing coatings of dust on objects. A car is a terrible survival choice, but it's better than nothing. However, an even better choice is sheltering inside a building with a basement if possible. Basements might not seem like the best choice since so much of the fine debris is going to settle in low places, but the key is to choose a basement with as few entrances as possible, and then to seal those entrances as best you can. However, in many modern cities, especially in sunny SoCal, basements are rare. In that case, you want to move to the centermost area of a home or a building and shelter in place there. Staying at the core of a building will add distance and shielding between yourself and the harmful fallout. But if you're going to survive, you're going to have to take some precautions before the radioactive dust starts falling. Hopefully you've got duct tape available nearby, in which case you need to immediately seal all windows and doors with duct tape. A closed window will be fine to protect you from the initial larger grains of debris that falls down first, but every window is leaky and the finer particles will ride in on those air currents, potentially poisoning you inside your shelter. This is why it's important to seal windows and doors with tape and to make your shelter as far away from any window as possible, ideally past several closed doors. Your first priority is securing your shelter, and luckily, you found an intact office building to hide inside along with a few other survivors. Working quickly, you seal off all exterior windows and then taped up the doors leading to the inner core. But now that you're somewhat safe, it's time to get naked. No, you're not repopulating the Earth already, you're avoiding a very nasty death by radiation poisoning. If you were outside at the time of detonation, there's a serious risk that you've already contaminated your clothing with radioactive particle debris. That's why any of you who were outside when the bomb went off need to immediately remove all outer garments and put them in a plastic bag of some kind, then seal the bag off. If possible, put that first bag inside a second plastic bag and store it somewhere far away from you and make sure everyone is aware of its location. You're also going to immediately want to start wiping everyone down. This means using the buddy system to get in those hard-to-reach spots that you can't get by yourself. You're going to be stuck with your new friends for a while, so what better icebreaker than to get naked and give each other a quick wipe down? You need to remove all exterior contamination from your body so that it doesn't rest against your skin and damage your body with ionizing radiation. You can do this with simple soap and water to scrub away any grime, but even just brushing off with a clean cloth is enough. Afterwards, though, anything that you use to clean each other off with is going to have to go into another containment bag. Never reuse or reopen an old containment bag already full of contaminated material. Now that you've avoided the most imminent hazard, exterior contamination, your next greatest threat, and one that will persist for a while, is interior contamination. This will come from the finer radioactive debris that can get inside wounds or be breathed in and settle into your lungs or along your esophagus. Inside your shelter, your odds of survival are good, but only if you stay in place. You've created distance and shielding, but now you need to add time to the equation. Fallout contamination decays very quickly, with it giving off 80% of its energy in the very first day. However, the debris is still energetic enough to be deadly even after one day. For every 7-fold factor of time, dose rates decreases by a factor of 10. 2 hours after detonation, the fallout will have lost half its energy, but this can still be extremely deadly. Ideally, you'll want to shelter in place for a full 72 hours before leaving your shelter, at which rate remaining radioactive debris will still be harmful, but only if you remain in contact with it for long amounts of time. Unfortunately, your city is going to be a hell-blasted nuclear landscape after an attack, so you'll be in constant contact with radioactive debris even after 3 days. That's why the CDC recommends you wait a full 7 days before leaving your shelter, as this will give you the best survival rates. By that time, radioactive fallout will have a fraction of its original energy and be much less dangerous. At this point, external contamination is unlikely to be a serious threat anymore. But the biggest threat comes from internal contamination. Too weak to penetrate the skin at this point, radioactive debris that gets lodged into wounds or inside your lungs can still be deadly or pose serious long-term health risks. So when you leave your shelter, you want to take precautions against breathing in fine radioactive particles. Face masks like the type we've been wearing due to the coronavirus outbreak are okay, but not great for this. You'd be better off wetting a t-shirt or other large cloth and wrapping it over your mouth and nose. It's important to keep it wet as the moisture will attract fine particles and trap them, and important to cover both your nose and mouth. After any excursion, you'll need to wash whatever protective equipment you've used and all exterior garments. If you can, give your body a good washing down as well, just to remove any fine particles that you might end up breathing in or shoving into a cut or scrape accidentally. Hopefully, you had food and water in your shelter, or at least just water, or you probably aren't making it to this milestone, and your story ends here. But if you've managed to survive 7 days, you're now going to have to think about long-term survival. First, you need to consider if it's best to remain where you are or seek help. Assuming that this was a small-scale attack, there should still be help from the military or emergency response agencies coming to your city. If it was a full-scale nuclear conflict, though, you're probably completely on your own. If you think help is coming, work on increasing the resiliency of your shelter. Improve the shielding to the outside by creating layers of plastic or cloth like curtains that hang in front of the exterior doors. This will help keep radioactive dust down as people go in and out. If you can, simply make suits out of garbage bags to wear over your outer clothing. That way it can be removed and thrown away in specified disposal locations after each trip. If you've got water to spare, create 2 cleaning areas for boots. You can do this by filling 2 buckets with water and dipping your boots into each one in succession. After a few rinses, dispose of the water somewhere so there's no chance of it contaminating you or your shelter. You're going to want to pay special attention to boots and feet, as they'll be the most likely to get saturated with fine radioactive debris since most of it will settle on the ground. You'll also want to make sure your shelter is visible to search and rescue parties who are looking for survivors. Create large geometric shapes made of bright materials to immediately grab the attention of a helicopter or passing rescue vehicle or patrol. SOS is a global sign of distress, but in a city you should be able to find many creative ways of making it obvious that your shelter is occupied with survivors. Make sure to regularly clean your emergency displays to make it obvious people are still alive. Otherwise, rescue workers might simply assume that the shelter has been abandoned. Whether you move out or shelter in place, you'll probably need to find food and water eventually. It should be obvious, but avoid anything that isn't completely sealed in non-permeable material like plastic. Canned goods are excellent options as they're airtight, but even pastas or breads in plastic wrapping is okay to eat as long as the wrapping is completely sealed. Just don't open any food items outside of your shelter. And it's best to wrap them in cloth or plastic as you transport them through the outside world and back into your shelter, though as usual you'll need to decontaminate whatever you use to protect them. You'll also want to get rid of the wrapping material or tin cans after they're done if they've been in an unsecured area where they could have been exposed to outside dust. Water will be trickier because there will almost certainly be no electricity in your city, which means no water pumps to supply water. If you're lucky enough to be in a safe interior location when an attack takes place, immediately plug up sinks and bathtubs and fill them with water, if it's still flowing. Underground water pipes will be safe from the radioactive fallout for a long time, but not forever, as eventually the body of water that feeds them will be contaminated. That's why even if you have running water after an attack, you don't want to rely on it. Better yet, stock up on water bottles, which should be easy to find in shopping centers and corner stores after an attack. Most water bottles are made of thick plastic, which will keep the contents safe even after fallout has descended. However, as usual, you want to decontaminate every bottle of water you bring into your shelter from the outside before you start messing with it. If you can't find water, your best option might be just to start moving and get out of the city, or head toward emergency services. Major airports are a good place to head toward, as it's likely this is where the first rescue efforts will take place. However, if you can't reach one, or if government help isn't coming, survival will still depend on getting out of the city. It'll help if you can figure out which way the prevailing winds are blowing and head perpendicular to them. You don't want to head into the wind because you could just be getting facefuls of contaminated dust. Instead, much like a rip current, head perpendicular and get out of the stream of air that's carrying radioactive waste. Once you're out of the city, your best bet is to head toward high ground. You're safer on the leeward side of a mountain where the wind hasn't blown radioactive dust and debris onto the soil. Radioactive fallout will settle in low areas, and rains and streams will wash it down the mountains and into the valleys and plains below. It would be wise to learn what major drinking water sources are around your city and then head to those that are on high ground. If you can shelter in a safe area for a few months, radioactivity levels and remaining debris should be manageable. At this point, if you're forced to continue living in the area of a nuclear attack, a long, healthy life is out of the question, but you can probably enjoy a moderately long life with few serious health problems. Some radioactive elements will remain deadly for years. Strontium-90, for instance, is still dangerous after 10 years, as is cesium-137. If you can't get away from the site of a nuclear attack, or if your entire nation has come under attack, there's probably little you can do to avoid these dangers, as these elements will become part of the environment itself. But there's a reason why both Hiroshima and Nagasaki are habitable today, and that's because a nuclear attack from another nation will almost certainly be of the airburst variety. A ground-burst weapon is one designed to explode when it hits the ground. This greatly limits its destructive potential, but also causes massive plumes of irradiated material. However, an airburst weapon explodes above its target, so the destructive shockwave and thermal radiation can hit as wide an area as possible. This also comes with the benefit of shooting much of the weapon's radioactive output into the atmosphere or into space. Within days of both the Hiroshima and Nagasaki explosions, people were inhabiting the ruins and living lives with few, if any, health effects. So cheer up, because the end isn't here after all. Now it's time to grab your trusty Pip-Boy and head off into the greatest Fallout LARP event the world has ever put on. A column of Ukrainian armored vehicles accompanied by tanks approaches their ready positions, prepared for a fresh assault into the Russian defenses outside Kherson. The Ukrainian counteroffensive has been wildly successful, beyond even the scope of the most optimistic military planners. Russia can't hold the line against Ukrainian grit and firepower, and its troops are on steady retreat across the entire Eastern Front. On Friday, September 30th, 2022, Russian President Vladimir Putin had annexed 4 regions of Ukraine, declaring them Russian territory. This now allows him to use all available means at his disposal to neutralize the Ukrainian counterattack. Now, with his back against the wall, Vladimir Putin becomes the second person in history to order the use of nuclear weapons in war. A brilliant fireball lights up the night sky, incinerating the column of Ukrainian vehicles. Even inside their armored shells, the Ukrainian soldiers are killed instantly. Those who were far enough away to survive the heat and blast are killed by the radiation bombarding their bodies. Several hundred Ukrainian soldiers and a few dozen vehicles are destroyed. The attack has been largely insignificant in terms of military value. Ukrainian forces have mastered the tactic of dispersing and reuniting again for sudden offensives, but it sends a clear message to Ukraine and the rest of the world. Thousands of miles above the planet, a United States satellite, part of the American Space Surveillance Network, detects the distinct double flash of a nuclear explosion. The alarm is instantly relayed via communication satellites using the secure Link 16 encrypted radio frequency system. Within 30 seconds of detection, the alarm has already reached a U.S. Space Force monitoring station in North America and similar offices around the NATO alliance. Minutes later, the alert reaches the desk of U.S. President Joe Biden. Picking up a secure phone, he dials a direct connection to General Mark A. Milley, the chairman of the Joint Chiefs of Staff and the most powerful military officer on the planet. President Biden speaks only 3 words into the receiver: execute Plan 36. The coded order is relayed via U.S. communication satellite to Stuttgart, Germany, and the office of the commander of U.S. European Command, General Christopher G. Cavalli. Within minutes, the authenticated order is transmitted to U.S. forces in RAF Bentwaters and RAF Lakenheath inside England. A separate communique is dispatched to the USS supercarrier George H.W. Bush, currently stationed in the Mediterranean. The Bush is loitering in waters off the southern coast of Turkey, and the ship immediately turns into the wind as its flight deck erupts in a flurry of activity. Ever since Putin's threats of using nuclear weapons, the American military has been prepared to respond. Beneath the deck of the Bush, F-18 Super Hornets are having AIM-160 MALDs attached to wing hardpoints. Each Hornet can carry 2 of the large weapons, a capability kept secret from the world until now. 2 squadrons of the high-performance aircraft are quickly made ready and begin the journey to the flight deck above where they stand ready. In England, crews rush to man a fleet of 8 B-52 Stratofortress bombers. The big planes are the backbone of the U.S. bomber fleet and can bring a frighteningly large amount of firepower to bear thousands of miles away. Joining them are 4 B-2 bombers also kept on alert status, their crews ready to go at a moment's notice with bellies full of weapons. Within 15 minutes, the first planes are taking to the sky and turning southeast toward mainland Europe. 2 hours later, the bomber fleet links up with 2 squadrons of U.S. Air Force F-22 Raptors, taking off from bases in Germany. The Raptors are flying in stealth configuration, which means their wing pylons are clean of weapons. The internal weapons bay, however, is loaded with 6 AIM-120 air-to-air missiles and 2 AIM-9 short-range missiles in the side bays. The formation continues toward the Black Sea, the F-22s leading the way. An hour later, the F-22s link up with a loitering U.S. Air Force tanker aircraft in order to top off their fuel stores. The B-52s loiter as the F-22s refuel. With enough capacity to fly strike missions in Europe from their home bases in America, the B-52s have no need to refuel. As the F-22s refuel, NATO AWACS aircraft flying along the Ukrainian and Turkish coasts sweep the skies with their powerful radar, looking for any potential hostile targets that could pose a problem for the mission. The aircraft's powerful radar only has a range just above 250 miles, so they can only see across approximately half of the Black Sea. Soon they'll move for a closer look, but in order to maintain the element of surprise, the AWACS stick to their normal flight pattern instituted at start of the Ukraine war. The F-22's refueling, however, is the signal for the USS Bush to begin launching her Super Hornets. One by one, the high-performance strike fighters take to the sky, their compatriots wheeling in the skies above the carrier strike group and waiting until both squadrons have taken to the air. Then the planes split into two groups, taking similar but distinct routes north and into Turkish airspace. One route will take the group west of Ankara, while another will take the other group over Sivas. An hour later, both squadrons pivot northeast, heading straight for the Black Sea. The B-52s, B-2s, and F-22s have now reached the Black Sea. The United States operation to punish Russia for its use of nuclear weapons is a go. The B-2s take the lead now. The entire formation has turned south and then east again, which will allow it to skirt Crimea by 70 or so miles, well out of the effective range of Russian air defenses in the region. The target is Novorossiysk and the Russian naval base located there. After the sinking of the Moskva, the Russian Black Sea Fleet has moved its largest surface combat vessels here in order to keep them out of range of Western anti-ship weapons provided to Ukraine. The AWACS aircraft have shadowed the formation, sweeping the skies with their powerful long-range radar. The job is to look for enemy fighters, thus allowing the accompanying F-22s to operate without their own search radars on, ensuring their stealth. However, the powerful radar is being picked up by Russian sensors in Crimea. The Russians now know that an attack is coming. NATO hasn't deviated in any significant way from its pre-announced patrol routes for months, and the only reason an AWACS aircraft could be approaching Russian shores is if it's backing up a major air attack. It's not long before the AWACS planes pick up the signature of multiple Russian fighters taking to the skies. The data is relayed via data link to the Raptors, who stand ready to greet the Russian challengers. It's now time for the Super Hornets to do their part. Skirting along the very edge of Russian long-range radar, the Hornets fire off their MALDs one by one. In minutes, 40 of the big missiles are screaming straight at mainland Russia. But the weapons aren't bombs. The miniature air-launched decoy is an advanced drone that can perfectly replicate the radar return of nearly any aircraft in NATO's arsenal. Currently, the decoys are spoofing Russian radar returns to convince them a flight of B-52 bombers is incoming from the direction of Turkey, escorted by F-18s. This is a credible threat. The U.S. maintains multiple air bases in one of NATO's most geographically strategic allies. Payloads away, the Hornets turn around and head for the bush. Russian long-range air defense radar in Crimea has spotted the real B-52s, but the appearance of a flight of B-52s escorted by F-18s incoming from Turkey is a more pressing threat. Russian ground crews have been scrambling to put 3 squadrons of interceptors into the air. Now a squadron consisting of a combination of MiG-29s and MiG-31s are wheeling south from air bases in Crimea and the Russian mainland. The jets are in full afterburner mode, which consumes fuel at a frightening rate but pushes them to supersonic speeds. They must get to within 70 nautical miles of the incoming B-52s so they can intercept them with their long-range air-to-air missiles. The R-77-1s, NATO codename Adder, are inferior in range to their American AIM-120 counterparts, with only a range of 68 miles. This is roughly the range of the expected Harpoons carried by the American B-52s, who have a range of around 75 nautical miles. Russia always doubted the U.S. would respond with its own nukes, and this only left one possible target for American vengeance: the Russian Black Sea Fleet. An alert reaches the Russian vessels in waters just off of Novorossiysk. The fleet currently consists of the guided missile frigates Ladny, Admiral Essen, and Admiral Makarov, which has taken the role of fleet flagship after the loss of the Moskva. Landing ships Nikolai Filchenkov, Orsk, Azov, Novocherkassk, Caesar Kunikov, and Yamal are all at dock. The smaller guided missile corvettes Vyshny Volaichok, Samum, Ingushetia, and Graveron take up stations around the frigates. This is the bulk of the Russian Black Sea Fleet currently in operation, with a few vessels on duty in the Mediterranean. U.S. Navy submarines and F-15 Strike Eagles from Europe are already en route to destroy them. The entire fleet turns with their noses parallel to the incoming threat. This will allow each ship's CWIS systems maximum opportunity to engage any missiles that penetrate long-range air defenses. S-300 and S-400 batteries along Russia's eastern Black Sea coast opened fire on the incoming decoys. The decoys are easily within the 242-mile range of both systems for targets with a radar return as large as a B-52. The number of incomings is overwhelming. This is a major American air assault, and the air defense batteries expend most of their missiles. The vessels of the Black Sea Fleet opt to let the shore units do their work and focus on defending against any aircraft or missiles which slip past. American B-2 stealth bombers open up with AGM-158C LRASM anti-ship missiles, the planned replacement for the Harpoon. The U.S. military still operates only a small number of the weapons and only recently adapted them for use with the B-2. Each of the 4 B-2s unleash a volley of 16 of these low-observable anti-ship missiles, and Russian radar screens light up as they detect the 64 incoming missiles. The attack is a complete surprise, and the missiles are moving so fast that shore-based air defense batteries have no chance of catching the missiles before they reach their targets. The fleet is on its own to defend against the attack, but the LRASM's low observable features making the missiles difficult to target. To make matters worse, their missiles now dive toward the ocean, flying just above the water as they scream toward their targets. The missiles are within several dozen nautical miles before Russian radars can not just detect them, but target them. The Russian ships immediately fire off decoys. These immediately begin to fire off electronic signals meant to be more powerful than those emitted by real vessels, thus luring in anti-ship missiles to strike them instead. However, the American missiles are built with optical target recognition systems, ensuring that the weapons can tell the difference between decoys and the real thing. At just over 36 miles, the Russian radars finally can target the LRASMs, and the frigates are the first to open up with long-range surface-to-air missiles. It's like trying to hit a speeding bullet with another bullet, and the LRASMs can be difficult to target. Of the 64 incoming missiles, 16 are struck and destroyed. With just miles left to go, the corvettes open up with short-range Komar missiles. These missiles have a much smaller warhead, but several manage to strike true. Another 8 LRASMs are knocked out of action. The American weapons now enter the terminal attack phase and suddenly pitch up, climbing high into the sky. More Russian anti-air missiles fly out to try to swat them out of the air. Another 6 LRASMs turn to fiery wrecks. Each missile identifies its own target, prioritizing the larger frigates. The sky fills with tungsten from the frigate Sea-Whiz systems. 10 more LRASMs are destroyed before striking true, but 22 find their targets. The 1,000-pound warheads slam into the Russian frigates. The Admiral Essen takes 10 of the missiles. She's already destroyed by the time the last 3 slam into her, but the missiles aren't smart enough to identify lethal battle damage. The Ladny only takes 2 and remains afloat with moderate damage. Admiral Makarov takes 6 LRASMs to the deck. The rest of the weapons either strike the smaller corvettes or explode in the water, missing their targets. Only 2 of the Russian frigates remain alive, along with 3 of the corvettes. 2 Russian ships are quickly sinking below the waves. The attacking B-2s turn around and head for home, visible on Russian radar only for a moment as each bomber opened its bay doors. To the south of the fleet, the Russian interceptors are now in range to engage the MALDs and open up with R-77 missiles, ripple firing at the incoming formation. Each missile will find its own target, and with such a dense concentration of forces, should have no problem striking true. The Russian fighters are rapidly turning and burning for home, fully aware that American AIM-160s have a longer range than them. The lead Hornet should have opened fire by now, yet strangely no incoming missile threats are detected on radar. Reporting this to ground control, Russian commanders are beginning to grow suspicious. A second wave of interceptors is redirected west toward the incoming flight of 8 B-52s. This happens to put them directly on course to intercept the B-2s, who are slow and vulnerable. In full afterburner, the Russian fighters will soon be in range of not just detection, but targeting of the stealthy aircraft. Right now, their focus are the big American bombers, who are completely vulnerable and helpless. Radar detects no accompanying fighters, which makes the Russian pilots very nervous. There are only 2 possibilities here. The 8 B-52s are actually decoys, and the main attack is the 40 aircraft formation to the south, or the attack from the south is the decoy, and this is the real thing. If the latter is the case, there can only be one reason why radar isn't detecting any accompanying fighters. The U.S. has put its F-35s or F-22s into the fight. The intercepting fighters get their answer shortly after entering the Black Sea. The F-22s have skirted out into the Black Sea and away from the shore, keeping out of range of shore-based radar, which can detect them within 100 or so miles. The Russian interceptors have even weaker radar and can only begin to pick up traces of the stealth fighters within 50 or so miles, but can only get good targeting locks from a few dozen miles away. The F-22s turn on their own targeting radar long enough to get a solid lock on the incoming Russian MiGs. On their radars, the Russians detect only a brief blip as each F-22 rapidly volley fires their AIM-120Ds. The AIM-120Ds have a classified range easily in excess of 100 nautical miles, and the MiGs don't even get to within range of the B-52s before they're forced to take evasive actions from the incoming missiles. Each missile has flown high into the sky immediately after firing, and now plummets down on the Russian fighters. Each pilot tries to notch the incoming missiles, but most of them strike true. The surviving fighters are forced to turn around at full afterburner, but the Raptors already have loosed another volley of aims at them to encourage them to retreat. The only way to defeat the American stealth fighters is to overwhelm them with numbers and absorb their long-range missile attacks. Once at close range, the Raptors would have been at a disadvantage, but the Hornet-launched decoys fooled the Russians into splitting their forces. With the skies free of enemy fighters, the B-52s are safe to get within 75 nautical miles of the surviving Russian vessels and loose their harpoons. 96 anti-ship missiles are soon screaming toward the Russian ships. The frigates immediately respond with their long-range air defense missiles. The harpoons are far older technology and don't have the same low observability features of the LRASM. Long-range air defense managed to take out 20 of the incoming missiles as the harpoons get within a dozen miles of the ships. Then the corvettes open up with their shorter-range missiles. Each ship is rapidly volley-firing their entire missile stock, knowing their lives depend on it. 20 more of the harpoons are knocked out before they get into range of the fleet Sea Whiz. Tungsten once more fills the sky as a wall of lead rises up to greet the incoming missiles. 22 more harpoons are knocked out either by missiles or Sea Whiz. Decoys manage to lure away a dozen or so of the harpoons, but 22 of the surviving missiles strike true. The 500-pound warheads smash into the corvettes and frigates, most of which have already been damaged by the LRASMs. Despite having half the warheads of the previous rocket volley, the blitz of missiles is lethal. As the B-52s head for home, Russia sends up more interceptors to take on the flight of MALDs to the south. The decoys are easily blown out of the sky by air and ground-based defenses, but all that does is expend precious resources Russia can no longer easily replenish. Their job is done. They succeeded in diverting Russian attention south and splitting up its interceptors. The Russian Black Sea Fleet has been destroyed. All that remains is 4 submarines which Russia doesn't dare put to sea for fear of being targeted, and a complement of landing and support craft. The surface combat vessels were the important targets, and Russia suffered an irreplaceable loss. In the span of an hour, it went from the dominant military power in the Black Sea to the weakest. Blockades of Ukrainian ports are no longer possible, and Russia has been punished for its use of nuclear weapons with the loss of hundreds of sailors and billions of dollars in hardware. What remains to be seen is if the deterrent has been effective, or if President Vladimir Putin will resort to even greater use of nuclear weapons as retaliation. If so, the United States stands ready with its allies to respond with either conventional or nuclear power. In Eastern Europe, the war over Ukraine has heated up to unprecedented levels. Despite being cautioned against it, the Russian President Vladimir Putin has authorized the use of chemical weapons against the stubborn Ukrainian resistance. Thousands have died since the attacks began. The President of the United States had warned Putin there would be an appropriate response if he dared to use weapons of mass destruction. Stockpiles of American VX gas had been moved to Europe in anticipation of just such an event, and now cruise missiles laden with the deadly gas rain down amongst Russian troops. VX is banned by the UN's Chemical Weapons Convention of 1993, but the US has retained its Cold War-era stockpiles as a deterrent. Now, thousands of Russian soldiers die as the deadly nerve agent paralyzes their bodies, and they slowly asphyxiate to death. Russia is quick to respond with the use of low-yield tactical nuclear weapons inside NATO bases in Poland. President Putin claims these bases are legitimate targets, as it's thought here that the NATO and partner nations such as Japan and Australia have been resupplying the Ukrainian army. Thousands more die in the attacks, and NATO responds in kind. Just hours later, NATO nuclear weapons are striking bases along the Russian border, destroying troops, armored vehicles, aircraft, and thousands of tons of critical supplies badly needed by Russian forces inside Ukraine. For 12 hours, there is no reply, and the world breathes a sigh of relief. Perhaps this small exchange of tactical nuclear weapons is enough. Maybe a full-blown nuclear confrontation can be avoided. Those hopes are dashed, however, as 12 hours and 11 minutes after the first nuclear strikes inside Russia, Russia's nuclear forces unleash a small but deadly salvo against NATO's strongest member, the United States. The United States has approximately half an hour to react, but can the US rally, defend the homeland from a nuclear attack? The first line of defense against nuclear weapons comes with detection, and for this task, the United States has been operating Defense Support Program satellites for decades. The special satellites use very sensitive infrared sensors to detect the telltale infrared plume of a rocket launch, and they do it from a geosynchronous orbit, many thousands of miles above the Earth. Their unique orbit allows them to always face the same side of the Earth at all times, so they can remain vigilant 24/7 and have zero lapse in surveillance. Traditional satellites that orbit the Earth will only be able to observe one part of the Earth for a limited time, and even constellations of satellites can produce coverage gaps over time. An added defense, the high altitude of DSP satellites make them difficult to destroy or interfere with from Earth, making them more resilient during a conflict. Defense support program satellites are aging, however, and currently being replaced with the new generation space-based infrared system, which builds on the core concepts of DSP and adds more robust capabilities, such as better resolution to detect the launch of even smaller, shorter-range missiles, and an increased resiliency against attempts to spoof, jam, or destroy them. Sibir's HiGeo-1 was launched on May 7, 2011, and 2 other classified satellites believed to be a part of the program were also launched in 2006 and 2008. Further satellites have since been launched, giving the United States a robust early warning capability. Sibir's LOW was planned to be a constellation of 24 lower-orbit satellites meant to also track ballistic missiles, but with the ability to distinguish between warheads and decoys, a critical need if an incoming nuclear attack is to be stopped. The system would have had 2 major sensors, a scanning infrared sensor which would acquire ballistic missiles during the boost stage of flight, and a tracking infrared sensor which would follow the missiles and also track warheads, debris, and decoys. Sibir's LOW was eventually absorbed into the Space Tracking and Surveillance System program, which aimed to test technologies for the tracking of missiles to aid in targeting. STSS proved to be very successful, tracking not just traditional ballistic missiles and their payloads, but even intermediate-range ballistic missiles which have a shorter flight time and are thus harder to track and target. In tests, the STSS program was successfully destroying intermediate-range ballistic missiles by guiding interceptors to their targets. The program further proved its capabilities on the 8th of July 2011 when it was tested against a short-range air-launched target, simulating a shorter-range air-launched cruise or similar missile. Since these missiles are already hoisted up high into the atmosphere, they're much smaller and dimmer, as they require less powerful rockets burning for a shorter amount of time to get them to their target. In September 2021, the 2 satellites taking part in STSS testing were decommissioned and moved to higher orbits to prevent accidental collisions in the future with other objects in the same orbit. Since then, the US has been very secretive about any low-altitude missile tracking and targeting systems, but it's likely they're looking for more survivable options given the proliferation of anti-satellite weapons in the militaries of China and Russia. Once an incoming missile is tracked, targeting data can be fed to interceptor systems, and of those, the US has a few with varying rates of success. During the Cold War, President Ronald Reagan imagined a comprehensive anti-ballistic missile defense system that would make the United States safe from nuclear attack. Since then, attempts to implement successful missile defense systems have proven difficult. The main problem is that ballistic missiles are moving at thousands of miles an hour, giving any defenses very little time to react, and even less time to launch a second set of countermeasures if the first fails. The second problem is the sheer altitude of an incoming ballistic missile. These missiles leave the atmosphere and cruise through space for the mid-course portion of their flight, meaning that any defense against ballistic missiles requires the ability to reach up and into space. This requires a missile of significant size if taking the traditional ballistic approach. Another option is laser weapons, but they're mostly ineffective due to atmospheric scattering, and would instead need to be installed on satellites. Thanks to dispersal of the beam, though, these satellites would have to be fairly low in orbit, which means you would need a lot of them to maintain a constant screen of protection over the US homeland. The next issue is actually hitting the missile itself. Our best option for missile defense is kinetic, meaning that the best method we have for destroying a nuclear ballistic missile is by using another missile. However, this requires 2 missiles moving at thousands of miles per hour to physically ram into each other. A ballistic missile is moving so fast that a traditional anti-air kill method, such as fragmentation warheads that only require a missile get close to its target to shred it with shrapnel, simply aren't effective. Plus, ballistic missiles are large, and once they're in their mid-course phase, simply shredding some critical systems isn't going to stop it from releasing its nuclear payload on your head. It's been described as hitting a bullet with another bullet, and requires math so precise it would make Einstein himself cry to sleep at night. Even the slightest miscalculation or a particularly strong gust of wind as the interceptor rises to the sky could be enough to spell a miss, and thus the US has developed some very powerful computers to guide interceptors to their targets. To be safe, though, an intercept attempt will typically involve multiple interceptors. But there's yet another hurdle in knocking out any incoming enemy ballistic missiles: decoys and countermeasures. A modern missile is capable of carrying multiple warheads, but only some of these will be real. The rest will be dummy warheads meant to lure enemy interceptors. This means that it's best to intercept a missile before it has a chance to release its payload, but this is highly unlikely and requires missile defenses very close to the launch site. It's the entire reason that Russia has been so cautious about U.S. missile defenses in Europe, and China has joined in after the deployment of U.S. missile defenses to South Korea. With multiple decoys, an interceptor has to strike the correct target, or else you've just wasted a very expensive missile of your own and accomplished nothing. But ballistic missiles will also carry chaff to confuse radar tracking the incoming warheads, basically a cloud of highly radar-reflective material. It's unstealth technology meant to be as visible as possible and thus confuse radar, making targeting impossible. The best or worst part is that it's really cheap too, basically costing only a few $1,000s while defeating radars and computer systems costing tens of millions of dollars. So, how in the world does the US defend against a nuclear attack? The main defense against nuclear attacks on the homeland seeks to destroy the enemy missile during the mid-course phase. This is when the missile has entered space and is cruising along, making small adjustments and preparing to enter the atmosphere. This will be the largest portion of the missile's flight path, depending on how far away the target is. To knock enemy missiles out of space, the US has developed the ground-based mid-course defense system. These large missiles are designed to fly into space and smack head-on to an enemy missile, using a dummy kinetic kill warhead to smash the enemy missile into dust. The system consists of approximately 60 interceptors deployed in 2 bases, one in Fort Greely, Alaska, and one in Vandenberg Space Force Base, California. A third site was proposed to be based in Poland, but Russia got extremely upset over it and was eventually canceled. This geographic dispersal allows GMD missiles to knock out threats coming from Europe, which would be traveling over the North Pole, and threats from Asia or the Pacific. If you're wondering how the system defends against missile launches from enemy submarines close to shore, it doesn't. And you better hope that on that day the US Navy's on the ball and hunting down hostile subs. The GMD system is made up of 6 main subsystems. The first is the Exo-Atmospheric Kill Vehicle. This consists of a solid metal 140-pound interceptor fitted with various maneuvering thrusters. These thrusters wouldn't help the kill vehicle accelerate, but are instead there to help the interceptor make course adjustments and hit its target with pinpoint accuracy. The Exo-Atmospheric Kill Vehicle was meant to be replaced with a redesigned kill vehicle in 2025, but the contract was canceled due to serious design problems detected by the Department of Defense. A replacement will have to wait until the next generation interceptor program begins to mature. Next is the Boost Vehicle, the massive rocket that carries the interceptor up into space. This comes with its own missile silo and silo interface vault, all located underground. The Battle Management Command, Control, and Communication System, or BMC-3, helps guide the missile to its target by feeding it targeting data and ensuring uninterrupted communications with the interceptor and boost vehicle. Ground-based radar, space-based early warning radars, and forward-based X-band radars all make up the final subsystems of the GMD program. These veritable fleet of radars are all designed to provide high-resolution data during various phases of an incoming missile's flight, and their capabilities are classified at the highest levels. It's thought that these highly sensitive radar systems are so capable that they can detect aliens farting inside their UFOs, and they need to be if they're going to have any chance of hitting an incoming ballistic missile with another missile. GMD's effectiveness has been a subject of much contention, especially since it's cost the US billions of dollars. To date, the system has a success rate of about 55%, and critics are quick to point out that none of these tests have been carried out against dummy targets using a full suite of countermeasures. In reality, one could expect a success rate much lower than 55%. Luckily, the US has additional layers of protection against nuclear missiles. In response to Russia's anger over the proposed deployment of a missile shield in Poland, the US shifted focus to the development of the Aegis ballistic missile defense system. This system is split into 2 components. The ABMD is designed to destroy short to intermediate range ballistic missiles while they're still in the atmosphere, either on ascent if close enough to a launch site, or more likely on descent. Aegis BMD, also known as Sea-Based Midcourse, is designed to intercept ballistic missiles during their flight through space, and thus is capable of targeting missiles of any range. The origin of this program is in the mid-1980s with President Reagan's Strategic Defense Initiative, the much vaunted attempt at creating a shield against any missile threat. Initially, SDI called for space-based railguns, but 40 years on and railgun technology is far from mature, with the US Navy canceling its own railgun cannon project. A new system known as Lightweight Exo-Atmospheric Projectile, or LEAP, was developed and testing began in conjunction with the sophisticated Aegis system. LEAP would eventually lead to several successful tests against ballistic missile targets and become Aegis Ballistic Missile Defense, using the standard Missile 3 to pulverize a ballistic missile. The first Block 1 system was delivered in October 2004, and an Aegis 3.0 update delivered in 2005. The world's best air defense system had just gotten the capability to knock ballistic missiles out of the sky. Aegis BMD would prove so successful that Aegis Ashore was developed as a land-based component, with a NATO Aegis Ashore ballistic missile defense system site being built in Romania and in Poland. On May 21, 2014, Aegis Ashore successfully detected, tracked, and destroyed a ballistic missile target. Aegis ballistic missile defense, whether ashore or at sea, uses the RIM-161 Standard Missile 3 for mid-course interceptions, and the RIM-156 Standard Extended Range Block 4 for the terminal phase interceptions. An interceptor is launched from a vertical launch cell and guided to its target by its home ship or Aegis Ashore facility, and then it collides with an enemy missile with over 130 megajoules of kinetic energy, requiring no explosive charge. Interceptions inside of the atmosphere or during the terminal phase of an attack carry blast fragmentation warheads, since the re-entry vehicle of a missile is much smaller than the larger ballistic missile body that needs to be destroyed during the mid-course in order to neutralize the threat. The benefit of Aegis ballistic missile defense when mounted on ships is that ships are mobile and thus can be quickly repositioned to defend likely target areas or be closer to a likely launch site, as it's better to target a ballistic missile as early as possible to avoid it deploying countermeasures. The ability to reposition your ballistic missile defenses is greatly valued by the U.S. Navy, as is the ability to help cover facilities or locations that might be left vulnerable either because no other defenses exist or because mid-course defenses have failed. A terminal phase interceptor fired from an Aegis-equipped ship might be the last-ditch effort that saves your city from nuclear annihilation. The US, Japan, Romania, and Poland all have Aegis Ashore facilities, and the US Navy has 5 Ticonderoga-class cruisers and 28 Arleigh Burke-class destroyers equipped with ballistic missile defense capabilities. These ships are split up, with 17 assigned to the Pacific Fleet and 16 to the Atlantic Fleet. Future shipbuilding plans, however, call for 80 to 97 total ships to be equipped with ballistic missile defense capabilities within the next 30 years. This is driven not just from fears of nuclear attack, but by the necessity of protecting the U.S. Navy from China's ever-evolving anti-ship ballistic missiles. China's missiles represent a serious threat to America and could push the U.S. Navy out of the South Pacific for good, if not counter. The U.S. has also helped Japan equip 4 of its ships with ballistic missile defense capabilities, and this number is also expected to rise in response to the development of North Korean nuclear weapons and the Chinese threat. The next layer of protection for the United States is the Terminal High Altitude Area Defense System, or THAAD as it's also known. It was first proposed in 1987 as a mobile ballistic missile defense system. At the time, the problem with ballistic missile defenses was that they were vulnerable to conventional attack as their locations were well known. Adding mobility not only increased survivability, but also allowed the U.S. Army to move them to locations where no other ballistic missile defense capabilities existed. At first, THAAD failed miserably, scoring only 2 successful intercepts out of 8 tests. However, as the technology matured, the success rate increased to nearly 100%. Though again, the system has been criticized for not tackling realistic threats, making full use of dummies and countermeasures. This hasn't stopped the system from being exported to U.S. bases around the world, and even for use with partner nations such as Turkey, the United Arab Emirates, where it's intercepted a Houthi ballistic missile in 2022, South Korea, Romania, and Israel. THAAD works much the same way as any other terminal phase defense system. Its powerful AN/TPY-2 X-band radar tracks the target as it flies through space, and once it's plotted where and when the target will re-enter the atmosphere, it launches an interceptor. The interceptor is then guided to the target by the radar, where it uses a kinetic warhead to smash the incoming missile to pieces. THAAD is believed to be so effective that China has complained about its deployment to South Korea, despite U.S. assurances that its goal is to protect the nation from North Korean nuclear weapons. Next, the U.S. has one final line of defense for ballistic missile intercepts, the U.S. Army Patriot Missile Defense Battery. Originally, the Patriot system was meant to take on airborne threats, but as the threat grew to include cruise missiles and ballistic missiles, the system was evolved to allow it to destroy these faster, nimbler targets. As a replacement to the Nike Hercules system, the Patriot is now the U.S. Army's only line of defense against airborne targets. The Patriot's main appeal is its ease of setup, requiring less than an hour to prepare for operation. All of its components, including fire control, which itself includes radar, engagement control station, antenna mast group, and electric power plant, and the launchers are all truck or trailer mounted, giving them great mobility. The Patriot uses an AN/MPQ-53 and AN/MPQ-65 passively electronically scanned array radars, which are faster and more efficient than older mechanically scanning arrays, like the type you've probably seen deployed on Russian vehicles inside Ukraine. The AN/MPQ-65 radar features a second traveling wave tube which amplifies the radar's signal and gives it more power to track and detect hostile threats. Unlike similar SAM units, the Patriot uses only a single unit to search, identify, track, and engage targets, while other systems use multiple radars to do the same job. The Patriot's radar beam is very narrow in comparison with traditional radar dishes. This, however, allows it to focus more energy in a smaller space, which in turn allows it to better detect and track small, very agile, and high-speed targets such as missiles. The radar also has increased effectiveness against stealth aircraft, and the focused beam is very resistant to attempts to jam it or interfere with its operation. If the system detects it's being jammed, it quickly changes frequencies to avoid the jamming signal, repeating as necessary to provide good data to intercepting missiles. Patriot missiles work much the same way as any other terminal phase defense system by launching a missile on an intercept course with an incoming target. This is a short-range defense only, though, and it can only protect a small geographic location and only during the terminal phase of a ballistic missile's flight. In essence, Patriot batteries are the last line of defense when all of their options have failed. The current state of U.S. ballistic missile defenses leaves some serious doubts as to whether protecting from a nuclear attack is realistically feasible. To date, successful intercepts have been carried out under very controlled conditions, and there's a lot of reason to doubt that any of these systems would be able to defeat a modern ballistic missile equipped with a full host of countermeasures. Even if capable of doing so, each intercept would require multiple salvos of interceptors for redundancy, which means that even with the full complement of U.S. ballistic missile defenses operating at peak efficiency, only small pockets of the U.S. homeland could be offered some measure of protection in the case of an all-out nuclear war. Compared with the ballistic missile defense capabilities of other nations, though, this might be all that's needed for the United States to survive as a nation, and to do so in far better state than any of its potential adversaries. To be truthful, though, that's not saying much, as the global consequences of a full nuclear exchange will likely trigger human extinction anyway. This brings up the question of if ballistic missile defense is even worth it, especially considering the extreme cost. To try to improve ballistic missile defense in the future, the U.S. is already looking at new technologies. During the 2000s, the U.S. experimented with an airborne laser concept, essentially just a Boeing 747 equipped with a massive laser on its nose. The airborne laser solved many of the problems of ballistic missile defense, namely the difficulty in guiding a kill vehicle to its target, when both it and the target are flying at hypersonic speeds and over great distances. The airborne laser could instead target a missile during its most vulnerable phase, the boost phase, and destroy it at the speed of light. In multiple tests, the airborne laser successfully destroyed ballistic missiles and other airborne targets. However, ultimately the project was scrapped in 2010 due to numerous problems. First, the laser was only effective at very short ranges due to atmospheric scattering. So, as Secretary of Defense Robert Gates stated, if the laser was to be used to intercept missiles from Iran, it would have to be orbiting inside of Iran's national borders to do so. Secondly, in order to successfully defend against ballistic missile threats from a single hostile country, a fleet of 10 to 20 of the aircraft would be required at a cost of $1.5 billion each, and costing $100 million a year to operate. The airborne laser was officially dead, but the data gained from testing has been invaluable in developing other directed energy weapons. In fact, the concept of an airborne laser has now been once again resurrected, only this time with a laser mounted on very high-altitude unmanned drones. These drones would fly at altitudes far in excess of large jet aircraft, such as the original test platform, and at such heights would maintain laser beam integrity over longer ranges. An unmanned drone flying at 65,000 feet would be able to engage targets as far away as hundreds of kilometers, and a fleet of smaller unmanned drones would be cheaper to procure and operate. They also could fly for very long periods of time through airborne refueling. As technology improves, we might once again see the return of the canceled airborne laser program, albeit in a much different form than predicted by its original builders. It's even possible that these lasers could be installed on low Earth satellites, and this would in fact be the most efficient method of ballistic missile defense. However, doing so would prompt other nations to begin arming their own satellites and create a space weapons race. Inevitably, in order to protect from space-based interception, nuclear weapons would be logically moved to space themselves, where they could be dropped straight down onto targets below, making most forms of interception impossible or mostly useless. But as it stands today, while the US could probably successfully defend from an attack by a rogue state such as North Korea, there's a little hope of surviving even a moderate exchange of nuclear weapons after hundreds of billions spent in ballistic missile defense. Sirens wail across the landscape. Red lights flash in military bases around the country. Someone has launched a barrage of nuclear missiles at the United States. They sail over New York City, blast past San Francisco, and rocket away from D.C. These major cities all seemed like they should have been key targets, but instead the missiles are headed to several unsuspecting states in the middle of the country, places where people thought they'd be safe. The United States' nuclear sponge is attracting the enemy nukes as planned. Unfortunately, anyone living in these states is about to be annihilated in a holocaust of nuclear explosions. There are 5 U.S. states that still house a large number of nuclear missile silos in a concentrated area. These states are what's known as a nuclear sponge. The question is, do you live in one of the 5? If nuclear war breaks out, you may not be as safe as you think. First, what is a nuclear sponge? During the Cold War, the U.S. was very concerned about major cities and metropolitan areas being targeted by Soviet nukes. In order to draw attention away from these areas, the Department of Defense came up with an interesting idea. They hypothesized that if a large number of ICBM nukes were placed in the middle of the country, then the Soviet Union would have to target them first if they were to attack, because if they didn't, the U.S. would be able to retaliate with nukes of their own. These missile sites were placed in rural areas so that the number of casualties would remain low. Forcing the Soviet Union to attack those rural areas would draw fire away from places like New York City, Washington, D.C., or any other densely populated part of the country. The remote nuclear sites were known as a nuclear sponge since they would absorb the missile fire from the enemy. The missile silos that originally made up the United States' nuclear sponge were deep underground and spaced far enough apart that the Soviet Union would need to commit a large percentage of its nuclear arsenal to destroy them. These nuclear launch sites were put in the plain states, so they could be launched northward, travel over the Arctic, and hit the Soviet Union on the other side of the planet. So, just to recap, a nuclear sponge is the section of the U.S. where large numbers of ICBM nuclear missiles are housed, in the hope that if an enemy ever did launch a nuclear attack, they would commit a large number of their missiles to destroy the nuclear sponge. This would hopefully spare major urban areas from total destruction at the expense of the people living within or anywhere near the nuclear sponge. Right off the bat, you probably see some problems with the plan. And even when it was conceived during the Cold War, many people voiced their opposition to having nuclear silos in the middle of the country. Yet the Department of Defense built the nuclear silos anyway, and now with a renewed nuclear threat from Putin and the Russian government, there's been a large amount of money dedicated to updating the United States' nuclear sponge. Unfortunately, as we're about to explain, this is a huge waste of money, incredibly dangerous, and provides no real safety to anyone in the U.S. First and foremost, the U.S.'s main strategy for surviving a nuclear attack should be to never let it happen in the first place. Diplomacy and de-escalation should take precedence over everything else, and to be honest, updating the nuclear sponge should be at the very bottom of the list. In fact, it should be so far down the list it isn't even considered an option, because in the current era, a nuclear sponge isn't effective, as we'll explain in a bit. But first, let's examine why the U.S. is even considering upgrading its nuclear sponge, the history behind the original idea, and what states are part of the plan to draw fire away from major cities. All you can do is hope you don't live in one of these states if a nuclear war becomes a reality. The main reason we're talking about the nuclear sponge in the middle of the U.S. is that as Russia continues to suffer defeat after defeat in Ukraine, Putin has stated he's considering putting nuclear options on the table. The weapons he's talking about are likely tactical nukes, which can vary in size from a few kilotons up to 50 kilotons. These low-yield nukes would still cause massive destruction and irradiate the surrounding area. But they're nowhere near as devastating as strategic nukes, which have yields of 1,000 kilotons or more. The problem is, if Putin starts launching nukes in Ukraine regardless of size, NATO will need to respond in some way. And let's be honest, Putin is not the most stable individual, so if he feels threatened by NATO, he could launch the entire Russian nuclear arsenal at Western countries. He's probably thinking at this point, if he can't win, no one can. This has put the US and NATO on high alert. As a result, the United States is dumping huge amounts of money into its military. Hundreds of billions of dollars have been put into the United States' nuclear weapons program in recent years. Some of this money has gone toward upgrading the nuclear sponge in the middle of the country, which makes zero sense, as you're about to find out. At the end of the 1950s, when the Cold War was in full swing and the Red Scare had just destroyed the lives of countless innocent Americans, the development of the original nuclear sponge began. After some consideration, the U.S. government decided that the best location to install their ICBM missile silos that would be far enough away from major cities were in the plains of Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, South Dakota, and North Dakota. It was here that the first Minuteman nuclear missile silos were constructed in the early 1960s. After the Cold War ended, the silos in South Dakota were retired, which left the 5 other states as the current nuclear sponge of the U.S. Since their conception, the nuclear sites around these states have housed Atlas, Titan, Minuteman, and Peacekeeper rockets. However, the most favorable option was the Minuteman missiles due to their solid fuel and ability to be launched from a safe distance. The reason these states were chosen to house the silos was because their landscape allowed for relatively easy development while also having the space to build launch control facilities that could launch missiles from several silos at any given time. By the 1990s, there were around 1,000 Minuteman silos and approximately 100 launch control facilities spread around Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, and North Dakota. However, there were several other reasons why these states made such a great nuclear sponge. The distance between them and Russia was short enough to hit Moscow, which is approximately 5,100 miles, while traveling over the North Pole. Also, the distance from the coast would give these sites enough time to launch, even if the enemy fired nukes from submarines along the coast. But the biggest motivator for building the missile silos in these 5 states was that they were sparsely populated, and if they were targeted, they would keep enemy missiles from hitting major cities. For all these reasons, if you live in Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, or North Dakota, you're in the nuclear sponge of the United States. During the Cold War, when both the Soviet Union and the United States could only launch nukes at one another using ICBMs, the nuclear sponge sorta made sense. There was still the problem of putting the populations in these states in danger of being killed by enemy nukes, but the nuclear sponge would likely attract much of the Soviets' total nuclear arsenal if they did decide to attack the US. Today, this argument does not hold any weight. The main reason why the nuclear sponge is so useless now is that if Russia were to attack, they have enough nukes to hit every nuclear silo and every major city many times over. It's estimated that Russia has somewhere around 5,977 nuclear warheads at its disposal. The nuclear sponge obviously doesn't require 5,977 missiles to be destroyed. Therefore, if Russia really wanted to attack the US, they could fire several nukes at each of the 5 states where the ICBMs are located and still send several thousand other missiles to hit all major cities in the US. Today, Russia and the US can launch nukes from submarines, which means that having a lot of stationary silos doesn't serve any advantage, and there's no reason to waste hundreds of nukes to destroy them. The missile silos in the nuclear sponge of the US are highly visible and would definitely be easy targets. However, strategically, it doesn't make any sense for Vladimir Putin or anyone else to waste their nukes on them in the current age of warfare. This brings us to another huge problem for the nuclear sponge. The original intention was for these states to draw nuclear fire away from major cities. But what about the people living in Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, and North Dakota? It's messed up that the US government willingly admits they built the nuclear sponge to sacrifice one part of the country to save another. But that's exactly what they did. Instead of sacrificing anyone, we might suggest that world powers work toward getting rid of nukes altogether, rather than deciding who is worth and not worth saving. Just having a nuclear sponge at all is terrible, and since the original argument as to why the US needs one are no longer valid, there should be no reason for the US to spend money updating it. However, billions of dollars are still being allocated to the silos in the middle of the country, and the reason why is appalling. Before we get into why money is continuously being funneled into an obsolete US nuclear sponge, let's imagine a terrifying scenario. What would actually happen if the military thought that there were nukes headed toward the silos in the middle of the country? A group of highly trained NORAD analysts at Joint Base Elmendorf-Richardson in Alaska sit at their stations. They're constantly monitoring thousands of data points to ensure the United States is safe from nuclear strikes. It's the middle of the night, but the sun is still up. During the summer months, there are almost 24 hours of daylight. It seemed to be just another normal night when suddenly, a red light started flashing on one of the consoles. The technician sitting near the station pushes their rolling chair over to the computer to get a better look at the flashing light. Their eyes open wide as they read the label. "I've got a nuclear launch indicator light going off over here," they yell. Everyone turns to look at them. Then a light at another station begins to blink, then another and another and another. "Get the Secretary of Defense on the phone," a commander yells. Everyone scrambles to figure out exactly where the nukes are being fired from and where they're headed. The President of the United States is startled out of his slumber by a dozen Secret Service agents bursting into his bedroom. "Sir, we need to get you to the bunker immediately," the lead agent says. There's no time for the President to get dressed. He throws on a robe and is escorted deep underground, where the Secretary of Defense waits for him along with several other high-ranking generals. "What's going on?" the President asks. "We just received word from NORAD," the Secretary of Defense responds. "They're tracking several nuclear missiles headed toward our Minuteman silos in the Midwest." There's very little time for discussion. The generals lay their options out on the table, but the President must make a final decision. It's been about 10 minutes since the warning lights started flashing in NORAD. And whatever the path the president's going to choose, he has to choose it now. The president's predicament is made worse by the fact that there is no way to know if the sensors at NORAD are malfunctioning or if there are actually dozens of nukes rocketing toward the middle of the country. Therefore, the president has to use his best judgment and the data available to make a choice that could change the world forever. On the one hand, he could just wait and let the events unfolding play out. If the nukes really were launched, the middle of the country would be decimated and thousands of US missiles would be obliterated. However, the United States would still have thousands of nuclear weapons still active aboard submarines and in storage sites around the country. The fear is that if the sensors are malfunctioning and the reading coming into NORAD is wrong, the president could inadvertently start a nuclear war if he launches the US's arsenal. This would be a fatal mistake that could destroy the world. The president has to think hard before coming to a decision, but he's out of time. "Hold your fire," he whispers to the generals sitting around the table. "We built the nuclear sponge for this very reason. We'll know soon enough if nuclear missiles really were fired at the US. I'm not about to start World War III over a malfunctioning computer." The president and his generals wait for what seems like an eternity. They receive confirmation that the skies are clear. The warning lights were triggered by a series of unfortunate events that mimicked a nuclear attack. Russia was testing several new rockets that it had just developed. A series of solar flares scrambled radiation readings aboard surveillance satellites, and a meteor shower was responsible for the atmospheric disturbances detected. If the president had been too hasty and fired the United States' nukes prematurely, he would have caused all-out war and the irradiation of our entire planet. This is a fictitious scenario that is based on very real events. There have been at least 3 false alarms in the past that could have led to nuclear war. All 3 of the events came about due to malfunctioning equipment. Around 40 years ago, the heads of the Department of Defense received a very ominous phone call in the middle of the night. The analysts working at a nuclear defense office acquired data that indicated 200 ICBMs were launched from the Soviet Union and headed straight for the United States. Everyone scrambled to identify if the readings were accurate. The world was on the brink of war when it was determined that the signals were the result of a computer glitch. Everyone stood down and the planet was saved. An even more terrifying event occurred in the Soviet Union. On September 26, 1983, the Soviet Union's early warning radar system showed the United States had launched 5 ICBM nukes at them. An officer in the Soviet Air Defense Force named Stanislav Petrov suspected this was a false alarm and double-checked the readings. Rather than immediately calling Yuri Andropov, the current dictator of the Soviet Union, and causing nuclear war to break out, Petrov waited for corroborating evidence. When none came, it was clear that the supposed missiles launched from the US were just the result of a satellite malfunction. It's these types of scenarios that should make us nervous when there are unstable dictators or presidents in control of nations that have nuclear weapons. All it would take is one malfunctioning computer or one mistaken reading to plunge the world into a nuclear war. And in a nuclear war, there are no winners. More recently, a bigger problem had been brought up around having a large number of nuclear missile silos in a relatively concentrated area of the US. As the nuclear sponge is upgraded and more sophisticated launch systems are put in place, there have been concerns that vulnerabilities might allow hackers to access part of the nuclear weapons programming. This would obviously lead to a devastating series of events. If hackers ever gained access to the missiles in the nuclear sponge, they could hold them for ransom. The US would likely have to pay huge sums of money to regain control of its nukes, and then would have to figure out how the hackers got into the system to keep it from happening again. In a worst-case scenario, hackers or terrorists that gained access into a nuclear device by infiltrating its software could detonate the nuke right in its silo. This would cause a massive amount of destruction and would irradiate the surrounding area. Even more horrifying would be if the hackers managed to launch the nukes. Perhaps they'd target populated US cities, which were the one thing that the nuclear sponge was meant to protect. Connecting land-based nuclear missiles to computer systems that hackers might infiltrate is the stuff of nightmares. The nuclear sponge is obsolete, dangerous, and puts the lives of certain American citizens ahead of others. The nuclear silos in the middle of the country should be retired and demolished. And since all these facts are rather obvious, you might be wondering why the United States still has a nuclear sponge. Or even a more pressing question is, why are huge amounts of money being funneled into an outdated Cold War-era set of silos that no longer serve any strategic significance? Like the answer to so many baffling questions that come out of politics and the government's choices, it all has to do with money. It's been reported that the United States plans to spend around $264 billion on its next-generation ICBM program. This money would be used to upgrade the silos and missiles in the nuclear sponge of the country. This is not being done to enhance the defense capabilities of the US or even make the nuclear sponge more attractive to enemy missiles. Instead, the tremendous amount of money being spent on upgrades is the result of greedy politicians and corporations. Companies like Northrop Grumman get paid vast amounts of money to develop missile tech for the U.S. military. This means that if the funding for programs such as the nuclear sponge ran dry, it would severely hurt the company's profits. Therefore, defense contractors tend to do a lot of shady things to ensure that the government keeps spending money on missile tech. To be fair, Northrop Grumman isn't the only private business contracted by the U.S. government, and it's not the only company benefiting greatly from money being spent on unnecessary military technology. However, in 2018, Northrop Grumman contributed $5.6 million to specific campaigns to ensure candidates who supported their cause were elected. Northrop Grumman spends more money lobbying than any other defense contractor, and only slightly less than tech companies like Amazon and Facebook. These huge corporations pay unfathomable amounts of money to influence the laws being made and the way the U.S. government spends its funds. This, of course, is technically illegal, yet it still happens all the time. The craziest part is that whenever Congress tries to pass a bill to reduce the number of missiles in the nuclear sponge states, they're often met with resistance from representatives of those very states. You would think that politicians and constituents would no longer want nuclear weapons within their borders, especially if it's going to put them in danger of being blown up. However, this doesn't seem to be the case. In fact, politicians from North Dakota, Wyoming, and Montana are known as the Missile Caucus because they constantly try to shoot down any bills that would remove nukes from their states. Why do politicians and people living in the nuclear sponge of the United States want to keep the nukes there? The answer, once again, is money. The building, maintenance, and upgrading of nuclear silos and weapons creates an enormous amount of jobs and brings in a ton of money to the states. Many citizens living within the nuclear sponge work for the U.S. government or one of the defense contractors that maintain the missiles and their silos. Therefore, if the government ever decided to remove the silos and get rid of the nuclear sponge in Colorado, Wyoming, Nebraska, Montana, and North Dakota, tens of thousands of people could become unemployed. Obviously, many of those states don't want this, which is why they vote to keep nuclear weapons within their borders. Until the U.S. government is willing to admit the nuclear sponge idea from the Cold War is no longer valid and can break their ties with defense contractors who rely on the nukes as a source of income, it's highly unlikely that the silos in the middle of the country will be retired anytime soon. It can't be stated enough that the nuclear sponge no longer has any strategic significance. Yes, if nuclear war broke out, the U.S. could launch its missiles from these silos, but at that point, who cares? If it ever came to nuclear war, the world would come to an end. The amount of nuclear weapons that are still active between the U.S. and Russia is appalling. It's clear that land-based missile silos serve no purpose and are outdated because you can literally find them on Google Maps. The real threat in terms of nuclear wars are submarines and stealth bombers that can deliver their payload anywhere in the world at a moment's notice. The nuclear sponge hasn't been a valid strategy for a very long time, and no matter how many upgrades go into the silos in the middle of the US, it'll likely never become a good strategy in the future. Even though some jobs are created by building and maintaining nuclear silos, many more jobs could be created if the silos were decommissioned and the land was used for other purposes, such as harnessing renewable energy. Also, if the US government decided to remove the silos, it would not only save tons of money, but it would also reduce the threat of these states being nuked in the future, which should be a win for everyone living there. Perhaps the best argument for getting rid of the nuclear sponge in the United States is that the money being used to fund it could go to other programs. Imagine how much of a difference it would make if the $100 billion spent on upgrading nuclear missiles and their silos went toward improving healthcare and education instead. Even if the US removed its nuclear sponge, it still has plenty of nukes to wage war and destroy the world if it really wants to. Therefore, the US might as well retire the Cold War-era nuclear sponge and invest the money into programs that might actually make a difference. Many analysts agree that the world is closer to a nuclear war today than at any point since the Cold War. But who is to blame, and which country will fire the first missile? These questions are not as obvious as you might think. Yes, the war in Ukraine has the international community on edge, as Russia's power-hungry dictator has boasted that he could resort to using nukes to salvage his losses, but there are also other nations that have nuclear weapons, which, if fired, would plunge the world into chaos. And unbelievable as it sounds, the first nuke may not be launched by Russia, but a small country thousands of miles from the front lines of Ukraine. There are currently 9 countries who are known to have nuclear weapons. We'll rank the countries in order of who is least likely and who is most likely to launch the nuke first. The world is always changing and geopolitical stances can shift at a moment's notice, but most of the world agrees that nothing good could ever come from using nukes. Unfortunately, this doesn't mean that they'll never be used. Before we dive into our list, let's take a brief moment to look through the players in this scenario and how the 9 nations with nuclear weapons procured them. It's also important to know how many nukes are still at large in the world today and who controls them. The 9 countries that currently have nuclear weapons in alphabetical order are China, France, India, Israel, North Korea, Pakistan, Russia, the United Kingdom, and the United States of America. The first nuclear device to ever be detonated was codenamed Trinity. The plutonium implosion device detonated on July 16, 1945 at 5:29:45 a.m. at a test site located 210 miles south of Los Alamos, New Mexico. It was at this moment that the age of nuclear weapons began. Only 21 days later, the first atomic bomb was dropped at Hiroshima on August 6th. On August 9th, a second atomic bomb detonated over Nagasaki. These would be the only 2 nuclear weapons ever used in warfare. 4 years later, on August 29, 1949, the Soviet Union successfully detonated their first nuclear device, called RDS-1, or First Lightning, at Semipalatinsk test site in what is today Kazakhstan. After the successful tests by the United States and the Soviet Union, both sides began ramping up production of nuclear weapons and stockpiling them. This was done in the name of deterrence to create a status quo of mutually assured destruction. In 1952, the United Kingdom successfully detonated its first nuclear device, followed by France in 1960 and China in 1964. It's theorized that Israel gained nuclear capabilities sometime in the 60s, but the nation refuses to confirm or deny whether they possess nuclear weapons or not. It is generally accepted by researchers and scientists that Israel does, in fact, have nuclear weapons. As the Cold War progressed and more nations started to stockpile nukes, it became clear there needed to be some sort of agreement to mitigate the already enormous danger these weapons posed. The Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty was formed and signed by the United States, the Soviet Union, and many other nations. However, at the time, both France and the People's Republic of China did not partake in the agreement. In 1974, India tested its first nuclear device, which in turn caused Pakistan to double its own efforts in order to keep up with its neighbor. There had been a conflict between the 2 nations for decades, and India having nuclear weapons shifted the power balance in the region drastically. However, 2 decades later, Pakistan successfully detonated its own nukes in 1998. Neither India nor Pakistan has ever signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. When the Soviet Union collapsed in December 1991, Belarus, Kazakhstan, and Ukraine all inherited nuclear weapons that were either deployed or stored within their borders. As far as we know, all of these nuclear devices were returned to Russia when all 3 nations joined the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty. Also in 1991, when the Persian Gulf War ended, Iraq was forced to discontinue its nuclear weapons program, the dismantling of which was overseen by the United Nations. During the South African apartheid, the government developed a secret nuclear weapons program and created several nuclear warheads. These were dismantled by the newly formed democratic government in 1994, making South Africa the only country willingly to decommission all of its nuclear weapons. In January 2003, North Korea announced it would be withdrawing from the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty to pursue its own nuclear weapons program. On October 9, 2006, Pyongyang officially revealed that it had successfully conducted its own first nuclear test. Iran and Syria have both sought to establish their own nuclear programs, but at this point in time, neither country has been successful in testing a nuclear weapon. It's worth noting that Argentina, Brazil, South Korea, Sweden, Australia, and Taiwan all have pursued nuclear weapons, and some were close to obtaining the bomb. But eventually, each nation signed the Nuclear Non-Proliferation Treaty and ended their nuclear weapons programs. Unfortunately, by the time the treaty was signed and went into effect, the United States and the former Soviet Union had already amassed enormous arsenals. It's estimated the U.S. has over 30,000 nuclear devices, while the Soviet held close to about 40,000 warheads at their height. Since then, both countries have dismantled many of their nukes. However, both nations still have well over 1,000 nuclear warheads each. It's estimated that today the United States has 1,419 active nuclear devices and Russia 1,549 strategic warheads at its disposal. A number of agreements have been put in place to limit and reduce these numbers even further. The most notable is the new Strategic Arms Reduction Treaty, or START. However, on February 21, 2023, Vladimir Putin suspended Russia's participation in the treaty in response to the West's support of Ukraine. This limited the amount of information sharing and inspections conducted by outside entities on the state of Russia's nuclear weapons. Across all the nuclear-armed countries are approximately a total of 12,512 nuclear warheads in existence today. So this brings us to the question, who is most likely to fire a nuke first? It's a complicated question, and the answer is always shifting as geopolitics change and conflicts arise in different parts of the world. However, we're going to do our best using the most reliable data available to order the nations with nuclear capabilities from least to most likely on who would launch a nuke first. At number 9 on our list and least likely to fire a nuke first is Israel. It's estimated Israel has somewhere around 90 nuclear warheads at its disposal, although most experts note it is highly plausible that the tiny Middle Eastern nation has enough fissile material to create a stockpile of around 200 nuclear devices, even though the nation has never admitted to having nuclear weapons. The secrecy around Israel's nuclear program likely means that these weapons are only for defensive purposes. Jerusalem constantly finds itself at odds with its neighbors, yet there has never been any indication that the Israeli military or leadership will use their nukes. Tensions between Israel and other countries in the area have remained high ever since Israel was founded in 1948. Wars have been fought, and people lose their lives to extremist activity almost daily. However, Israel isn't fighting one particular enemy. Instead, it's fighting against the differences between the Islamic and Jewish faith, coupled with the dispute over the Holy Lands that were, for all intents and purposes, stolen from the people who inhabited the region before World War II. Nuclear weapons aren't an effective way to protect Israel from differing ideologies, which is the reason that it probably is the least likely nation to use them. Number 8. China. Although many might suspect that China would be one of the most likely to use nukes as it's taken an aggressive stance in the South China Sea and with Taiwan, this is likely not the case. China has a very clear and strict no first-use policy. What this means is that Beijing will only consider a nuclear option if China itself is being attacked by a nuclear weapon. As of right now, China is the most dominant country in Asia. There are no nations in its immediate vicinity that would dare oppose Beijing, except perhaps India, which we'll discuss later on. Therefore, the chances of China launching a nuke are extremely low. It's estimated that China has roughly 410 operational nuclear weapons available for deployment. It has 218 strategic delivery systems to fire its warheads, including intercontinental ballistic missiles, submarine-launched ballistic missiles, and nuclear-capable bombers. That being said, the U.S. Department of Defense estimates that China might have as many as 1,000 nuclear warheads by 2030. As things stand right now, China has approximately 100 ballistic missiles that could strike the U.S. But again, they would only be used if China were attacked by nukes first, and the U.S. has no plans of going to war with China in the near future. Even more reassuring is the fact that China does not keep its missiles on high alert like the United States does. During peacetime, almost all nuclear warheads are kept separate from their delivery systems. China has also not invested anywhere near as heavily in first strike capabilities as the US has. As of right now, China is highly unlikely to use nukes. However, some analysts warn that the continued encroachment of the United States into Asia and closer to Chinese interests might prompt Beijing to increase the quantity and quality of its nuclear arsenal in the future. Number 7. The United Kingdom. The UK has stockpiled approximately 225 nuclear warheads over the years. Around 120 of these are operationally available and can be deployed at a moment's notice. Of these, the United Kingdom has around 48 submarine-launched ballistic missiles deployed at any given time, which can be fired from its 4 Vanguard-class Trident nuclear-powered ballistic missile submarines. These subs are the only means by which the UK has to fire its nukes, making it an exclusively sea-based nuclear power. There are a couple of reasons that the UK might fire the first nuke. Recently, the country has reversed its pledge to maintain a nuclear arsenal of no more than 180 nuclear warheads. Its new target is 260 nukes, increasing its previous stockpile by about 40%. This expansion of nuclear weapon numbers is contradictory to previous plans that were meant to reduce the amount of nuclear weapons each country had. But the UK is by no means the only country growing its nuclear arsenal instead of reducing it. Even still, an increase in nuclear warheads correlates to an increase in danger that something could go wrong or a missile could be misfired. There's also the fact that the UK is relatively close to the conflict in Ukraine. It's almost a certainty that the UK has submarines with nuclear missiles deployed in the North Sea, Baltic Sea, and the Barents Sea. It's highly unlikely that the UK would ever become aggressive and fire nukes on Russia purposefully, but accidents do happen. Maybe one of the British submarines receives a rogue signal they mistake for a nuclear war commencing on the surface, or perhaps there's a malfunction that leads to the misfiring of one of the sub's missiles. These scenarios are improbable but not impossible. Number 6. France. The war in Ukraine is becoming a very volatile and unpredictable conflict, which is why the proximity to the front line plays a role in these rankings. France is slightly closer to fighting than the UK is, making it more likely to deploy its nuclear arsenal. France has a stockpile of 290 nuclear weapons that can be deployed across 98 strategic delivery systems. This includes 48 submarine-launched ballistic missiles and 50 air-launched cruise missiles. The French government has been modernizing its nuclear weapons program for years. Unlike the UK, France does not currently have any plans to increase its stockpile of nuclear weapons, but they also already have over 50 more nukes than the UK. What puts France higher on the list is its willingness to admit there are some situations where it would use nuclear weapons first. French officials describe first strike situations as being extreme circumstances of legitimate self-defense. However, the fact that launching nukes first is even an option is frightening. Number 5. Pakistan. Perhaps the longest ongoing conflict on this list is the one between India and Pakistan. The most terrifying part about the tension between these two countries is that both have nuclear weapons. There's no indication that things will get out of hand along the Pakistani-Indian border in the immediate future, but as the climate crisis gets worse and huge numbers of people begin to suffer, a battle over resources and land could boil over in the region. For example, floods in Pakistan this year impacted a third of the country, negatively affecting 20.6 million people living in the nation. The total damages and losses are estimated to be around $31.2 billion, and $16.3 billion will be needed to initiate recovery efforts. With all the turmoil being caused by natural disasters, political disputes might be exacerbated. Pakistan is estimated to have around 170 nuclear warheads in its arsenal. Ever since India and Pakistan split into two nations in 1947, there's been a disagreement and friction between the two governments. The geopolitics of the region are complicated, but the truth of the matter is that both countries developed their nuclear weapons programs to protect themselves from one another. On top of territorial tensions, there's growing unrest within Pakistan itself, brewing from the mistrust of the current government and military. This has led to new players rising to power and becoming popular with the general public. However, their platforms are not always built on the promise of peace and prosperity. Pakistan has plans to increase its nuclear arsenal, and it's keeping a close eye on India to make sure they match what their rival neighbor is doing. What has become more concerning is that Pakistan has been ramping up production of low-yield tactical nukes, which could signify it is considering these weapons as an appropriate means to fight a war if a major conflict with India ever arises. Number 4. India. It's estimated that India has around 164 nuclear warheads and, like Pakistan, is continuing to build up its arsenal. Brutal heat waves have ravished parts of the country and killed hundreds of people. The reason that India is slightly higher on the list than Pakistan is that it also finds itself at odds with a much larger and more powerful adversary. China and India have been fighting with one another for some time. Both see the other as a threat to their economic influence and power in the region. India and China have also been arguing over the border along the line of actual control between Chinese-controlled Tibet and India for decades. These disagreements have only escalated to small skirmishes so far. However, these quarrels could develop into a bigger conflict in the future as China tries to become the sole major power in the Eastern Hemisphere. Unlike China, India does not have a no first-use policy when it comes to its nuclear weapons. This is cause for concern in the region, as India could go weapons hot to protect its border or send a message to China that it won't be bullied. There is a three-sided arms race happening in the region between China, Pakistan, and India. And even though this is part of the world that isn't discussed nearly as much as the war in Ukraine, it's important to keep an eye on what's happening in South Asia, where there are three nuclear powers with volatile track records. Number 3. North Korea. North Korea is in the top 3 not because it has an exceptional nuclear capability, but because it's run by a mad dictator and an oppressive regime. The Hermit Kingdom likely has between 45 and 55 nuclear warheads. However, since everything within North Korea borders is kept a secret from the outside world, it's difficult to pinpoint the actual number of nukes Pyongyang controls and how much fissile material it has stockpiled. It's been suggested that North Korea has around 10 or 20 missiles capable of delivering its nukes. But as numerous tests have shown, the viability of these delivery methods is questionable at best. And this is why North Korea is ranked 3rd on the list. Kim Jong-un acts like a spoiled child that has been handed everything on a silver platter, which is because that's exactly what he is. However, the deep hatred of the West and the United States in particular has caused North Korea to try and portray itself as being powerful and unafraid of its enemies. This has led the Korean People's Army to launch faulty ballistic missiles and carry out nuclear tests just to prove its irrelevant regional power. This desire to personify power could lead North Korea to misfire a nuclear device. The tragic part is that if North Korea were to launch a nuke, there's a decent chance that the delivery system could malfunction and detonate over the country itself. So perhaps North Korea will be the first country to fire a nuclear weapon, but it is very unlikely it'll hit its intended target. That being said, the unstable nature of those in charge of the country greatly increases the chances that North Korea will fire nukes. As of right now, the nuclear threats coming out of Pyongyang and state-controlled media have died down a bit, but North Korea definitely has nukes, and the leadership is definitely crazy enough to use them. Number 2. The United States of America. It's hard to decide where exactly on this list the US should fall. U.S. military and government officials constantly state that firing nuclear weapons could have catastrophic consequences for the planet. And they're absolutely right. An all-out nuclear war would decimate entire cities and countries. Nuclear fallout would sweep across the globe, covering everything in radiation. However, even though the U.S. is constantly talking about de-escalation, it also has a track record of acting first and asking for forgiveness later. To be fair, the U.S. is the only superpower in the world, and there's very little any single nation could do to stop it from doing whatever it wants. Currently, the U.S. has 1,419 warheads on 662 strategic delivery systems. It's estimated the U.S. has 100 B-61 nuclear gravity bombs that are forward deployed at 6 NATO bases in Aviano and Gedi in Italy, Bukel in Germany, Incirlik in Turkey, Kleine-Brohel in Belgium, and Volkel in the Netherlands. The U.S. also has 1,536 retired warheads waiting to be decommissioned, which means the total number of nukes deployed, stockpiled, and in line to be dismantled is closer to 5,244 as of early 2023. What puts the United States in the number 2 spot is that around half of its deployed weapons are maintained on hair-trigger alert. This allows them to be launched very quickly if orders are received. It also means that if procedures are not followed or a malfunction occurs, there are hundreds of chances an accidental launch could occur. The U.S. is separated from the war in Ukraine by the Atlantic Ocean, but it has played a huge role in delivering weapons, resources, intel, and funds to Ukraine, which shows how invested it is in the outcome of the war. Also, the United States has had nukes aimed at Russian targets ever since the Cold War began. The situation in Europe would have to get much worse before a U.S. nuclear option is even considered, but the fact remains that the United States nuclear arsenal is not designed to be a defensive one. The submarines and stealth bombers carrying nuclear missiles are offensive vessels with first strike capabilities. Whether it's a planned attack, a rogue agent, or a preemptive strike, the United States has the most capable nuclear arsenal out of any country in the world. The U.S. is also the only nation to have ever used nuclear weapons during a war. Could the Nagasaki and Hiroshima scenario play out again against Russia or China? It is something worth considering. The most likely country to use nuclear weapons is Russia. Vladimir Putin is an angry, unstable man. He has a death grip on the Russian people and is responsible for the slaughter of hundreds of thousands of people. Putin wanted to create a new Russian empire, and nothing was going to stand in his way. And that's why we are now well into the second year of his war in Ukraine. It should come as no surprise that Russia is number 1 on the list. As Putin has already stated numerous times, he isn't afraid to put a nuclear option on the table. He has yet to follow through on this threat, but if things start to go really bad in Ukraine and it looks like Russia will lose Crimea and the war, there is no telling how far Putin will be willing to go. As of September 2022, Russia had 1,549 active nuclear warheads and 540 strategic delivery systems. Since Russia suspended its commitment to the New START treaty, it's not clear if it's dismantled any more nukes or has instead been stockpiling more weapons. U.S. intelligence suggests Russia might have between 1,000 and 2,000 tactical nukes that could be used in the conflict with Ukraine. However, Putin and his regime know that if they are the first to fire nukes, the entire might of NATO will come down on them. It would be the end of the current Russian administration, as NATO forces would launch operations to prevent any further use of nuclear weapons. But again, if there is any country that will use nukes first, it's almost certainly Russia. Putin's gone all the way with his war in Ukraine. He cannot afford to lose, so if push comes to shove, there's no telling how far he'll be willing to go to avoid defeat. If Russia loses the war in Ukraine, Putin's life will likely be over. To prevent this from happening, the Russian dictator might be willing to put the entire world at risk by firing the first nuke. Congratulations! You're the first generation since the end of the Cold War where a nuclear apocalypse is a very real and likely possibility. So turn that frown upside down, because if you've been concerned over unaffordable housing, crushing student debt, wage inequality, global warming, and more, then nuclear war is the answer you didn't even know you were looking for. What are the odds that things will go nuclear in a hurry, though? Happily for all of us, the odds are actually quite excellent. The first and most likely source of a nuclear Armageddon that eradicates human life from Earth is the ongoing war in Ukraine. Vladimir Putin has been rattling his nuclear saber ever since the Russian army made a brave advance toward Belarus from the outskirts of Kyiv. Suddenly, Ukraine was no longer the pushover they and the rest of the world thought it would be, and things only went from bad to worse when the Russian army suffered more defeats during the 2022 autumn offensive. Since then, despite House Speaker Mike Johnson and MAGA Republicans blocking Ukraine aid and allowing Putin's army to begin to score victories, Russia is still in pretty dire straits. With Johnson threatened with being removed from the speakership, though, he suddenly found the fortitude to agree to pass a massive Ukrainian aid bill that threatened to create significant problems for Russia. Europe's massive ramp-up in aid and arms manufacturing is also slated to not just catch up to Russia's now wartime economy, but surpass it in both scope and capability. The question is, now that the West has finally taken the Ukraine war seriously, what happens when Russia's clown shoes army starts to suffer significant war-losing defeats? How will Vladimir Putin respond to the West at last providing war-winning levels of equipment while his own factories and oil refineries are increasingly under Ukrainian drone attack? With no means to score a conventional victory, will Putin turn to weapons of mass destruction? If he should do so, the United States has already pledged to retaliate. In a conversation with his Russian counterpart, the U.S. Secretary of Defense stated that the U.S. would destroy any unit responsible for launching a nuclear weapon. A second attack would result in the destruction of the facility from where the attack was launched. A third attack with nuclear weapons would result in the U.S. forces launching an all-out attack against Russian forces in Ukraine. Russia's been doing a pretty lackluster job scoring gradual victories over Ukraine's exhausted, under-trained, and under-equipped army. Up against the might of the United States military and its allies, Russia would crumple like Chris Rock getting smacked at the Oscars. Keep NATO's name out your mouth. But that's a bad thing, not a good one, because it forces an already desperate Russia back into the corner. And Putin's very survival likely depends on not getting completely obliterated in Ukraine, to say nothing of his massive ego. Thus, the condition for the use of nuclear weapons is set, and any nuclear attack against the US or NATO forces only ends in one way: Russia being turned into the world's largest radioactive parking lot. Unfortunately, despite the odds that Dmitry and his buddies sold the nuclear warheads and the missiles for vodka and turnip money being very high, at least some of Russia's missiles are likely to find their targets in the US and abroad. But this isn't the only nuclear flashpoint, because everyone's favorite bad boy, Kim Jong-un, has got himself nuclear weapons. Knowing that losing a war against South Korea and the US means an end to his dynasty, Kim Jong is extremely motivated to use nuclear weapons before they're destroyed by the US or ROK Special Forces and aircraft. This would prompt a nuclear response from the United States, given that South Korea is under America's nuclear umbrella. Not only does North Korea have weapons that can now reach the continental US, but there is the China question. How would China respond to multiple nuclear impacts right across its own border, knowing that massive plumes of radiation and debris would be blown inland by ocean breezes and into China's most populated regions? In effect, a nuclear attack on North Korea is a nuclear attack on China, and President Xi is unlikely to sit on his hands. His own political survival and the legitimacy of the Chinese Communist Party would be at stake, motivating him to respond with either conventional or nuclear force. And from there, it's a short spiral to total nuclear destruction. But the really good news is that we don't have to wait for war to be mercifully shuffled off this mortal coil by cleansing nuclear fire. At any moment, with heightened tensions between the world's major nuclear powers, any sort of equipment malfunction could trigger a nuclear war. But no, we hear you say, there's no way any simple error could trigger nuclear Armageddon. Surely, nuclear weapons and their related support systems are only watched over and maintained by the most competent of individuals and the best maintained equipment. Oh, sweet summer child, we too miss the naivete of youth. There have been so many close calls due to human error that, frankly, our continued existence on this planet might be all the proof anyone needs of a higher power. In 1956, NORAD was flooded with reports of Soviet MiG fighters in Syria, unidentified aircraft entering Turkey, a British bomber being downed, and sudden maneuvers carried out by the Soviet Black Sea Fleet. This looked to the US personnel exactly like the makings of a first strike against NATO, prompting fears that European partners would carry out nuclear retaliation. Except for the unidentified aircraft over Turkey, which was a bunch of swans flying in formation, and the Soviet fighters in Syrian airspace were a presidential escort for Syrian President Shukri al-Quwatli The British bomber that was apparently downed, possibly by Soviet fire, well, it experienced a mechanical malfunction, and the sudden maneuvering of the Soviet Black Sea Fleet wasn't a preparation for an attack, it was part of a publicly announced and scheduled exercise. Thanks to the recent solar eclipse, social media is awash with all sorts of moon conspiracy theories. But in 1960, the moon wasn't just fake, it was a full-blown Soviet nuclear first strike. Radar equipment stationed at Thule, Greenland, with the job of detecting incoming Soviet missiles flying over the North Pole, mistook the rising moon as a swarm of missiles. The only thing that stopped a massive counterattack was the fact that Soviet Premier Nikita Khrushchev was in New York City at the time for a UN meeting. A year later, Strategic Air Command Headquarters suddenly lost contact with NORAD and multiple ballistic missile early warning sites. These communication links were all hardwired and independent of each other, making it incredibly improbable that they would all experience a simultaneous malfunction. This left only one option: Soviet sabotage in preparation for a nuclear attack. SAC proceeded to prepare the entire American bomber force for a strike against the Soviet Union until it was discovered that while each of these lines of communication was independent and redundant, somebody had the bright idea to run them all through the same relay station in Colorado, a relay station that had experienced a technical malfunction. In 1962, a bear nearly ended the world. This was the height of the Cuban Missile Crisis, and the US military expected the Soviets to carry out sabotage just before a nuclear first strike. At midnight on October 25th, a guard at the Duluth Sector Direction Center spotted a figure climbing the security fence. He activated the sabotage alarm, setting off similar alarms across the entire region. However, at Volk Field in Wisconsin, faulty wiring meant that instead of the alarm sounding, a klaxon alerted Air Defense Command nuclear-armed F-106A interceptors to launch immediately. The crews of these aircraft had been told that there would be no drills and thus believed that a nuclear war was already taking place. It was only an officer in the command center who drove his car onto the runway and stopped the aircraft from taking off. The intruder was also eventually identified as a curious black bear. Those aircraft could have been recalled via radio, maybe. Recognizing the potential for enemy spoofing, most nuclear crews were instructed to completely ignore radio calls once they were airborne in a real-world scenario. Like the crew of a French nuclear-armed Mirage 4 in 1966, which due to a thunderstorm disrupting electrical transmissions, received a wartime takeoff order by accident. The jet was on the way to deliver its AN-11 atomic bomb to its target and ignored all radio calls as per their training. However, the heavily burdened jet required in-air refueling, and when they reached their rendezvous point, there was no tanker waiting for them. They were forced to turn back to base and abort their mission. It was only then that they learned of the error. If you think these kinds of errors are limited to the past, when early warning systems and nukes were pretty new, you'd be incorrect. In 1995, Norway nearly ended all creation by launching a simple research rocket. Russia had been informed of the launch beforehand, but nobody had bothered to tell the Russian radar operators manning the nation's early warning system. The detected launch began on a trajectory perfectly mirroring that of an expected American first strike using submarine-launched weapons close to Russian shores. This actually caused Russian President Boris Yeltsin to activate the nuclear football, and for a few minutes, the world was a button press away from destruction. Are you feeling better yet? We hope so, because no matter what problems you're facing, nuclear war is close enough to take them all away. But how would you personally be affected? Will you be one of the lucky hundreds of millions who get to leave the world behind via nuclear obliteration? Or will you be a cast member in Amazon Prime Video's Season 2 of Fallout? There are 4 primary targets for a nuclear strike, and both the US and Russia have the hardware to hit all of them in a full-blown exchange. You might think major cities would be the first target, but you'd be wrong. First up on the nuclear chopping block is each other's nuclear capabilities. This means missile fields and nuclear weapon storage depots. The attacking nation would hope to eliminate their opponent's nuclear capabilities before a retaliatory strike could be launched, or at least a significant portion of them, to limit the number of weapons that could be used against them. This move favors the one who shoots first, which is why the nuclear triad is so important. With the ability to launch nuclear weapons via air, sea, and missile silos, nations become resistant to devastating first strikes. Next up are centers of government and military power. This means capitals like Washington and the Kremlin, but also major military installations and naval bases. Believe it or not, each nation would expect a conventional war to follow a nuclear one, or at least have to act like such a thing would be possible. Thus, major troop concentrations and stockpiles of equipment would be targets for the nuclear flame. Are you an E2 with a 45% interest loan on a brand new Dodge Charger? Don't worry, a nuclear bomb is en route to renegotiate that loan to 0% interest and 0 payments. Surely you're probably thinking, now I'll be set free from the burden of existence by nuclear attacks that hit major cities. Well, you'd still be wrong, because next up are targets of strategic importance for the long-term survival of a nation. This is nuclear war, after all, one of the few types of war left where the express intent is the complete eradication of a nation-state. This means wiping out food and resource production areas. Hate the impact that fossil fuels are having on our environment? You're gonna love it when nuclear bombs annihilate and irradiate vast swaths of the Gulf of Mexico, Texas, Alaska, and other oil and coal-producing areas of the United States. It's the ultimate Green New Deal, with everything glowing green with radioactivity. Literally overnight, nuclear war will bring humanity's carbon emissions to 0. So if you're an environmentalist, then vote for nuclear war in the next election. Millions of people suffer from gluten allergies that severely impact their health, and exponentially millions more don't actually know what a gluten is or refuse to eat it because it's trendy not to know science. The good news is, for both of those crowds, that nuclear war will solve gluten allergies forever. With the massive grain-producing territories of the United States and Russia, who provide the bulk of the world's grain, all blanketed with nuclear strikes. If you hate the cruelty of factory farming, the good news is nuclear weapons will forever liberate hundreds of millions of animals across American and Russian farms. The point of these strikes is to literally starve your opponent into extinction and thus prevent them from rebuilding their society. Alright, it's finally here. We've teased you long enough. With nuclear infrastructure destroyed, major government and military centers in ruins, and most farmland and strategic resource sites irradiated, it's finally your turn. It's finally time to be set free from the nightmare of late-stage runaway capitalism. It's just a prank bro social media influencers and a government dominated by geriatrics. Now the cities are targeted, with major cities like New York, Los Angeles, and Dallas up first on the chopping block. The destruction of major financial and cultural sectors is paramount to the goal of complete obliteration of the enemy. The 9/11 terror attacks in New York City, in which only a small part of the city's financial sector was destroyed, still resulted in nearly a 1% GDP loss for the entire nation. Economists will tell you that nuclear war is bad for the economy. But what their propaganda doesn't show you is how nuclear Armageddon is the fastest and only way to reduce inflation to exactly 0%. These same financial experts will also tell you that runaway housing market requires careful legislation and market correction. What they won't tell you is that nothing will permanently fix the housing market and make homes affordable again, like the annihilation of every major urban center, along with the instantaneous death of over 50% of the population. Is nuclear war the solution to your problem of buying a new home somewhere you actually want to live because property is unrealistically expensive due to the runaway greed in an unregulated market? Now, we're not saying it is, but we're just saying that before you bash nuclear war, you might want to consider the positives. Nuclear war gets a bad rep, but the truth is it guarantees that either all your problems will be immediately solved or all your problems will be immediately solved because the sources of those problems are now radioactive ash. Sure, there will be new problems, but those can be fun problems with the right mindset. Hypocrites, after all, will play games like Fallout to escape their daily lives. But when they get to play Fallout for real, they'll complain about it. But what if you have a horrible misfortune of living somewhere that nuclear weapons aren't currently threatening? Somewhere like South America or Africa. Well, we hate to tell you, but the odds of you surviving a global nuclear exchange are actually pretty good. Don't worry though, you'll soon know the sweet release of death thanks to the rapidly collapsing global order and the effects of fallout. There are very few nations that are truly self-sufficient to any degree. Japan, for example, is so non-self-sufficient in food production that it recently became a national priority to increase the amount of farming done at home. Most of the products you buy today are shipped in from somewhere else. And even if you live in a nation large and diversified enough to have some amount of self-sufficiency, those goods still need to be shipped to your location. The number of nations who can produce their own oil, let alone refine it, is significantly low. Even lower in the case of nuclear war, as many of those nations would be targets themselves. During COVID-19, we saw the effect of disrupted global supply chains, or at least got a small taste of what pre-globalization used to be like. The problem is nations were once used to being largely self-reliant, or conducting most of their trade with nearby neighbors. Globalization has drawn the world together, but it also means that the components for things you use every day are built in 10 different countries and assembled in the 11th. It's not impossible for nations not directly affected by nuclear war to survive, but it will be very difficult, and their economies will shrink dramatically. This would lead to widespread chaos and economic collapse as millions cannot find work or afford food. Many of those nations would be eyeing their neighbors hungrily, eager to take their resources for themselves in order to maintain their own survival, and there would be nobody to actually stop them, with major powers like Brazil and Egypt easily swallowing up their neighbors. For all the flack the US gets for its global military presence, the US military helps stabilize the world by dissuading bad actors from starting a fight they'll lose. War never changes, and in the wake of a nuclear apocalypse, it would once more become mankind's favorite hobby. Brutal resource wars, likely with the use of non-nuclear WMDs like chemical and biological weapons, would be waged. Mass migration from nations targeted by nuclear weapons would create the greatest immigration catastrophe in history, and these migrants would likely still be extremely well armed. Despite the destruction of major military infrastructure, affected nations could likely still wield significant military strength, significant enough to overrun neighboring lesser powers. And with the gloves at last finally off, these nuclear states, who will have maintained a small reserve of nuclear weapons, would be very likely to use the nukes to get their way, especially against nations who can't retaliate in the same way. That brings us back home, because even if you survive the initial strikes, and by some miracle society continues, then congratulations, because you're getting drafted into the military. With Russia and the US absolutely crippled by nuclear strikes, both nations would turn their surviving military might on nations that were not initially targeted. Seizing resources from regional neighbors would be a matter of national survival, launching mankind into an age of resource wars. But in all likelihood, the end result for everyone on Earth from such a massive nuclear assault is simply extinction. Nations may limp along for a few years, but the effect of so much radioactive debris being spread across the planet is both an ecological collapse and climate disruption severe enough to seal humanity's fate. Mankind may be able to tolerate violent climate swings or even background radiation levels so elevated that everyone now has extra limbs, but the complex food web that we rely on could not. The total ecological collapse of the planet is inevitable from a full-scale nuclear exchange, with the only hope of survival being specially constructed shelters deep underground that could hold tiny populations for a century or more. We're pretty confident Elon Musk will eventually start building shelters that will definitely not be used to conduct unethical human experiments. Musk, after all, will need to ensure a portion of humanity survives to fight off Mark Zuckerberg's army of cyborgs for the ultimate fate of planet Earth. Now, if you want to be a spoilsport, then click here for how to actually survive a nuclear attack, or click this other video instead.